finns i en pdf. Så de...
Det är löst.
Det är löst.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Please have a seat. We're about to begin the second day of this conference. We will have people joining us throughout the first minutes, which is totally fine. But good morning, dear excellencies and dear participants. I hope you have some good rest and you're ready for the discussions that will begin in a few minutes. My name is Eddie Mujay, and I am the Senior Advisor at the Council of the Baltic Sea States, leading the anti-trafficking work of our organization. We're an international organization located here in Stockholm, gathering 10 member states around the Baltic Sea region. One of the politically prioritized areas in our work is human trafficking, which has been even more put on the agenda due to the unprovoked Russian aggression against Ukraine. So I'm very happy to be here today. I'm also happy about this event and following the discussions yesterday, I can note that something positive has happened when I look at the 10 previous years. We notice also in our region and in our organization where the issue of demand, from being very politicized and difficult to discuss and address and quite frankly recognize, is today much easier to discuss regardless of the legislations in our member states when it comes to prostitution. So something has happened here which is very positive. Human trafficking for sexual exploitation is, of course, first and foremost, as was exemplified yesterday, harmful for those exploited by this crime. But we also have to keep in mind that human trafficking is a threat, a severe threat against the states and our institutions. And combating this crime without addressing the demand aspect can severely hinder or make it difficult to effectively address this serious form of crime. We heard yesterday how important it is to recognize demand as a factor and a driver behind human trafficking, but it's also important to translate this recognition in theory into practical policies and legislations. It was said several times yesterday that it's a low-risk, high-profit crime. It's complex to investigate human trafficking and so on, but are there today legislative ways to simplify the understanding of this crime? And practically speaking, which effective examples are there today to use demand legislation in order to identify those exploited in it, prosecute the perpetrators, and convict them? How can we use demand to counter organized crime? This is what we will talk about today. I would like to welcome our excellent panel to the stage. Janna Davidsson, Swedish National Rapporteur against Human Trafficking for All Forms of Exploitation. Welcome. We have Helmut Spohr, who is Senior Director of Criminal Investigations from Germany. Welcome. Nenad Nacha, Team Leader Trafficking Human Beings from Europol. Anneli Tyrud Wallin, Senior Prosecutor from the Swedish Prosecution Authority. Margot Guimont, a magistrate from France. Joanna van Nieuwkerk, Judicial Cooperation Advisor from Eurojust. Eleni Mikhail Luizou, Head of Office for Combating Trafficking Human Beings at the Cyprus Police. Ruth Breslin, Lead Researcher, the Sexual Exploitation Research Program at the University College of Dublin. And Joanna Bauer, President of the Board at Elibrare, Romania. Welcome. I will start by asking each speaker one question each, and after the first round of questions, I will allow you speakers to, if you have any remarks or comments on what was said during the first round of questions, please raise your hand and take the floor. We will then open up for a few questions from the audience. I want this discussion to be as relaxed and interactive as possible. Without further ado, let's begin this discussion. And my first question, I will also ask the questions in the order you're sitting. So Janna, From an early identification point of view, how does the Swedish legislation prohibiting the purchase of sexual services enable organizations and agencies and authorities to get into contact with women in prostitution, practically speaking? How do you use this legislation? Please.
Thank you, Eddie. And also, I would like to say, dear Excellencies and delegates, and also thank the Swedish government for arranging this important conference on the topic. Well, I have both as a national rapporteur observed, of course, the field work conducted in this field and or this crime category, and I also have my own operative experience as working as an investigator in the human trafficking section here in Stockholm. And I know that through field work a lot can be achieved. It's crucial with the field work made in this against this crime, and the Sex Purchase Act enables us to be able to work on the field and to visit these apartments and these brothels where the women are selling sex. So I would say that the Sex Purchase Act is the key, really, to be able to access these victims at all. And already a sex purchase allows the police to arrest and follow through with important investigatory measures, such as seize electronic devices and to take DNA sample, which are crucial for discovering and proving all types of criminality. So it's a very important tool.
And to go a bit further, for example, it's often talk about the burden of reporting depending on the legislation.
Yeah.
What does it mean in practice for Sweden that selling is not prohibited? Can the police report? Do you see that the police, to a higher degree, report irregularities, so to speak, or human trafficking?
Absolutely.
Or who does this?
Absolutely. When it has come to the police knowledge or the prosecutor's knowledge that a sex purchase has been committed, then it's the police that reports it. It's not the woman who sells sex, which it usually is. It's the police that is reporting the crime. So it won't show that she's the one denouncing her trafficker, which is an important measure to protect her, which is also the same way that we protect victims of intimate partner violence.
But then one more just follow-up question. You go to these hotel brothels, or regardless of the environment, what information can you access? You have now this legislation. It's not forbidden to sell, it's forbidden to buy, so to speak. What information can you obtain from them? What do they tell you, basically?
Well, I mean, these women would never contact the police if it weren't for the field work. Let's just put it that way. And the police is cooperating with the social services, which is found a very good basis for this field work. And they have a very good contact with these women that, sometimes it's a crime prevention method to go on these field work missions, and sometimes it's a crime intervention, but many times it's a crime prevention method, which means that the police and the social services present themselves and let them know that they are there in case that the women need them. And then it has happened that the following day the police have been contacted by that same woman telling her story, which has led to big cases that we've had. And also in this trustful meeting, the police get to know about severer crimes that have been committed towards them, like rape, and which they would never reach out to tell the police if it weren't for that field work meeting. And we've also had cases where women that know each other in the same situation would advise to contact a certain police officer that they know is a police officer you can trust and
have good experiences.
Have good, they share experience, exactly. So
Thank
the
you.
field work is very, very important.
Yeah, so as you said, fieldwork
Yeah.
is not just the legislation is not just helpful in fieldwork, it's actually a key aspect in order to
Yes.
conduct successful
Absolutely.
fieldwork.
And to access the victims.
And have also the social services part, which I think is
Yes.
interesting, present at these visits, or
Yeah.
I would like to call them. Thank you, Jana. We'll get back to you a bit later. I would like to move on to Helmut Spohr from Germany. You have over 30 years of experience working in this field. And as most of us know, Germany has chosen a different path or strategy when it comes to prostitution and regulations. Can you please, to begin with, to frame the discussion, describe the situation in Germany currently, based on your experience?
Okay. Thank you, Eddie, for the question, and possible to be here. I can talk a little bit about the situation in Germany. I'm from the field, and the possibilities combating human trafficking in Germany are very poor. The current situation, policy, and its legal framework protect the profiteers in the scene almost like a shell, like a second skin. And this is difficult for the police work. The market in Germany in prostitution is huge. There are estimated 250,000 to 400,000 women in prostitution. A large number of them are not voluntary, and there are many victims. However, in 2021, there were only less than 300 investigation cases into human trafficking for sexual exploitation. Those are official number for whole Germany. This is extremely rare, extremely low, considering the size of the sex market. Also, most of these investigations had to be discontinued because of lack of evidence. The main reasons for this serious situations are, first, the enormous size of the sex market. It makes the situation messy. Human trafficking is a hidden crime because victims do not report the crime to the police out of fear. And to convict perpetrators, the personal evidence is ensured. Is required. The personal evidence is required, but victims are afraid to testify. And the laws in Germany, the laws in this sector, are very difficult to apply for the prosecution. And organized crime is often responsible for crimes in this sector. Investigations here require huge resources in terms of staff and time, and this is a real problem for the daily police work. And last, Germany ignores to address the demand for prostitution. Short result: the law enforcement system in Germany is inadequate to prosecute these types of crimes. How can this be improved? Should I continue?
Yeah, please continue. You have still time. I will interrupt you, don't worry.
Okay. Okay. How can this be improved? I think the policy like the Nordic model would have many benefits in combating human trafficking. A brothel ban in Germany would reduce the sex market on a massive scale. Only about 10 to 20% will then remain the so-called grey market. Then the police could focus on the smaller market and work more successfully. With the same number of personnel is very important. And there would be other possibilities to prove the crime, not only personal evidence. all profiteers of prostitution of others could be punished, including brothel operators, including landlords, advertising managers, and the like. Currently, exploitation is widespread in prostitution. For example, rooms are rented of up to 200 euros a day. A woman needs 3, 4, 5 till 6 johns a day for rent alone. And presently, this exploitation is possible in Germany because in practice, these profiteers cannot be prosecuted. I think with the Nordic model, this would change. Then all profiteers would be perpetrators, and they were better. At the moment, evidence, if any, can mostly only be brought against the direct perpetrators, the supply structures. There are the pimps, the traffickers, and dealers. However, the brothel operators are often also part of organized crime. The division of labor for joint profit is characteristic for organized crime. This is the best example in this area. It would also be much easier to convict these criminals with the Nordic model, I think so. And then, also important, with the Nordic model are also in focus the johns and can be better prosecuted. At the moment in Germany, johns are only punishable when they buy sex from a trafficked person. And this is very, very difficult to prove. And johns are responsible for the ever-growing market in this area, which can only be filled with not voluntary persons who have been tracked and forced in prostitution. And by the way, there are estimated 1 million men per day in Germany who buy sex. 1 million estimated even by government.
Helmut, let's pause with that horrible number. Let's get back to you in the second round of questions. We need to move on, but I know to the estimation of 400,000 up to 400,000 women in prostitution, and when you put the number of trafficking investigations in relation to that, you see that there's something missing, according to you. With the demand legislation, police would have tools, as I understand, to at least disturb these businesses or enterprises or whatever you call them in Germany. And also you mentioned, I just have to reconnect to that it's sort of built into the prostitution scheme in the industry, that several johns per day is necessary to even pay the rent to begin with. So, okay. Thank you for this overview. We'll move on to Nenad. On the same note, states might have challenges. We hear constantly that the levels of investigations and prosecutions is low in the EU. How can Europol support states when it comes to challenges in investigating and countering organized crime and human trafficking?
Thank you, Eddie, for this question. Allow me first to express my gratitude towards the Swedish government for inviting us here, but also towards you and all the other people who are involved to run these things very professional, very smoothly. Thank you for this. If you allow me, I would like to address both of my questions simultaneously. They're quite intertwined, and I think it will be much more...
Yeah, the other question was also about challenges, identify that you see from...
Thank you so much. For all the audience here, what I can say, especially for the one who are not so informed about the Europol. Europol is actually an EU agency, and we are established to support and to facilitate cooperation in cross-border investigations, especially in those crimes, in those investigations against serious and organized crimes and terrorism. It's seemingly quite simple concept, although we need to take into consideration a lot of things which we'll present. It's not like that. For example, just take into consideration all the EU member states we have at this moment, then each EU member state has a lot of different EU agencies, and then all EU agencies around the world and all different legislations, often not harmonized. And our task is to bring those people to sit together in an organized, harmonized way, and to find how we can address trafficking in human beings to be more effective and more efficient, which is an important task for us. So trafficking in human beings for Europol is also recognized as a priority. We have a regular policy cycle recognizing priority on a EU level, and since the beginning, from the past, trafficking in human beings unfortunately was recognized, and unfortunately it is going to stay with us for the foreseeable future. That's at the moment situation. Our main partners are law enforcement agencies. They are the ones who are providing us intelligence. They are the ones who are providing us operational data. We are analyzing this data for the purpose of combating trafficking in human beings. As a product of this analysis, we are delivering operational support. I'm going to touch upon this support a little bit later, maybe in a concrete example, but also strategic reports, helping us to understand the scope of the problem. And based on this information, based on this confirmed data, a reality is indeed sexual exploitation is the most reported form of exploitation for years. It is around 65, 70, 75% of all forms of exploitations. Then again, also what is very important to say is indeed women are the ones who are most reported as the victims or potential victims of trafficking for sexual exploitations, while the men are predominantly reported as the perpetrators. What is also been seen even in the cases recently when we have increased number of the women, female figures, and their role as a suspect, there is also information about the men behind, pulling strings, now more concealed. So trafficking in human beings is extremely lucrative crime. I think there is no need to repeat this. There is no need to ensure anyone here, everybody understands the importance how we need to address this problem in a coordinated and holistic way. We need to have not only reactive, in a way that we are arresting criminals and liberating victims, which of course is the most important, but need to address it in a preventive way, to prevent the crime before it even happens. It's not an easy task. No one said it's going to be easy. Today, we are still not having every investigation with a parallel financial investigation, which is a challenge. Financial investigation is one of the most important parts if you want to achieve our main goal, and this is eradication of the trafficking in human beings. Without seizing the illicit profit, we are not going to succeed. So we need to change, we need to adapt. Criminals are changing, this is what we are seeing. They are evolving a lot. For example, recently we are seeing things that violence is no longer visible, no longer in the scope like it was in the past. No one says it's not present. We just see less violence. We also see that it's now rare, it's less physical. But what we see, and which is very concerning, is increased use of soft, coercive, and sophisticated manipulative actions. And these actions are actually tailored for the victims, for the individual victims. So what is the outcome of these actions? The victim does not recognize herself as a victim. She doesn't want to cooperate with the authorities. Actually, they perceive authorities as an enemy. So a lot of gaps. How to overcome them? We need to adapt, find innovative solutions. Cooperation with the civil society organization has been proved very useful in bridging this gap. They are helping to regain trust between victims and the authorities, to collect really important, valuable information, not only to successfully understand the crime, because we need to understand the crime. Crime is not simple, it's very complex. We need to understand every aspect if we want to defeat it. And also to be able to collect information for successful continuation of the judicial proceedings.
Thank you, Nenad. We'll get back to you, get a chance to have additional remarks, but I take with me to the next question, the different legislations in the member states, and that sexual exploitation is still the main form, where women are exploited and men are the perpetrators, which to me sounds like nothing has changed. It's still very gendered exploitation form in human trafficking. But this leads me to Anneli Tirud-Wallin, prosecutor in Sweden. It was just said that there's different legislations in the EU, but the human trafficking for sexual exploitation is still there and needs to be countered. How can you use the Swedish, in your experience as a prosecutor, the Swedish legislation prohibiting the purchase of sexual services to counter sexual exploitation organized crime, operationally speaking?
Thank you, Eddie. And I would also like to take the opportunity to extend my gratitude and thanks to the Swedish government for organizing this conference. It's been a very interesting day yesterday, and my special thanks to those of you who are survivors, who have the courage to stand up and tell your story. I admire your courage. So I am, since almost 20 years, a Swedish prosecutor, and I work mainly with human trafficking cases and sexual exploitation of children over the internet. And for me, this question that Eddie posed to me, I've almost grown up with the Swedish sexual act. So for me, it's not so controversial that the man should be punished for buying sex and the woman should not be for selling sex. But as Janna, my colleague in the Swedish police, a rapporteur, told us, it gets the police access to the sites where the sex trade is being conducted. And we get access to the women, because many cases are initiated by a sex buyer being busted by the police, and we don't know anything else about the circumstances. So we need the women's story to establish what kind of crime it actually is, if it is human trafficking or if it's just if it stays at buying of sexual service. And if the woman should be incriminated, it will be very hard for us to get her statement. And the Swedish court proceedings also are based on the principle that the statements, the victims and the witnesses leave should be stated orally in front of the court. So we need to have the victim on board in order for me to get judgment, a conviction. So it's very important that the victim gets to tell her full story without incriminating herself. So it's also important for me because human trafficking is an organized crime. We know that. In Sweden, it's not criminal to be part of a criminal organization per se, but this is an organized crime. And we need the woman's statements to figure out the structure of the organization as well, and to recover the proceeds of crime.
Thank you, Anneli. I have a question also about how other legislations in Sweden can be applied to these cases, but I will do that in the second round. It's a very interesting case that you will tell us about. Important that the women in prostitution are not incriminated. This was also something Janna mentioned before. We'll move on to Margot Guillaume from France. And just like Sweden, France has prohibited the purchases of sexual services. What has been the impact of this legislation from your point of view? Because unlike the Swedish legislation, which came into place 1999, the French legislation came into place 2016, so rather later compared to the Swedish one. But in spite of this shorter time span, have you been able to notice any direct effects from a law enforcement or investigation point of view? please.
Thank you. I would like to also thank the Swedish Presidency for organizing this event and for inviting the French Ministry of Justice. I think we can all agree on the fact that human trafficking is one of the most despicable forms of organized crime, so it's really important to be able to work together. As you said, the French demand-reducing model is quite recent. It was created in 2016 with a new law on the 13th of April 2016. This law was quite important because it ended a previous model. It ended and suppressed the misdemeanor of selling a sexual act and created a new minor offense and misdemeanor of purchasing a sexual act. It's considered a minor offense but becomes a misdemeanor when the victim is a child and when the offender is a re-offender. What is important, and I want to react to what has been said yesterday on the fact that some victims, in some states, prosecution is only possible when the victim is part of a network, of a human trafficking network. It is not the case in our legislation. So what is an offense in our legislation is the fact to purchase a sexual act from a person who engages in prostitution, and this person, this victim, doesn't have to regularly engage in prostitution and doesn't have to be part of a network to be trafficked for the offender to be convicted. So conviction is actually quite easy in this legislation. What is also important in this law is that it compels internet providing services to take part into the fight against human trafficking by signaling websites that post announcements for sexual acts, and it also enacts a series of measures to protect victims. Maybe I can come back later on all those measures when it comes to victim protection in France. We have seen some evolutions and some results with this law. The first evolution is that we had another law in 2021 that was specifically designed to protect children from sexual offenses. So it was a broader law specifically for minors, but it aggravated some sentences when it came to sexual offenses and human trafficking and pimping of minors. Most of them are now crimes in French legislation. So that's going further in the fight against human trafficking and sexual offenses against minors. When it comes to statistical figures, I have some numbers about convictions. We had 129 convictions for purchasing a sexual act in 2017, so right after the adoption of the new law. And in 2022, it's 200 convictions. So the number is quite steady, and it's not too low, compared to what it could be. And compared to something that is important is that the law also created a new penalty, which is awareness-raising course for offenders, especially for first offenders, and it is possible for prosecutors to choose to seize a judge and to have a conviction, which will sometimes be a fine or imprisonment when it's a misdemeanor, or this awareness-raising course. So those statistics are only about convictions, but we also have the possibility as prosecutors to choose an alternative to prosecution and to tell the offender, you will follow this course, this awareness-raising course, otherwise I will prosecute you. So this is not inside those statistics, but it's one of the answers that justice often chooses, and it goes well with what we were saying yesterday about prevention approach and holistic approach to explain to offenders what is human trafficking and how we have to engage into the fight against human trafficking. I would like also to talk about the convictions about human trafficking itself, which have been rising a little bit since 2017, because in 2017 we had 140 convictions, and 2021 it was 188. But what is mostly what we can see, the most progress we can see is convictions regarding pimping, because in 2017 it was 1,049 convictions, people convicted, and in 2021 it's 1,375, so rising also. And I'd like to end about current tendencies about prostitution in France. Police services have noticed that there is a very, very big decrease of street prostitution. It used to be, in 2016, 54% of the victims of networks were street prostitutes. Now it only amounts in 2021 to 9% of the victims. On the other side, online prostitution has increased a lot. It's now 84% of the victims. So probably there is the effect of the sanitary crisis, also of course, digitalization of any kind of purchase, but it's a possibility that the law has pushed offenders, traffickers and buyers to hide themselves. So what we're trying to do now is fight against, well, as I said, child prostitution, but also online prostitution, because it's a very big challenge now for us.
Thank you very much, Margot. And thank you all for, you might not know, but everybody is on time in their remarks. So this is very impressive. A victim of trafficking, a victim does not have to be, or a woman in prostitution does not have to be suspected to be a victim of human trafficking in France for the police to kind of raise their eyes and to look beyond the surface to see if there is actually organized crime behind this. I also note the addressing exploitation of children and minors since 2021. This is an aspect we should not forget, and also recognizing the specific vulnerabilities and how aggravated the crime becomes when a minor or a child is exploited. And also an increase, you note, from 2017 in trafficking, but specifically pimping. This is something you can see an increase since the introduction of the legislation. And finally, you spoke about this decrease in street prostitution. If I'm not mistaken, this was also an intervention made yesterday by the Anna Skarhed, former Chancellor of Justice, which was noted in Sweden also. And having in mind, perhaps, that some of the prostitution may go, you know, online or whatever, it makes the online work, I would assume, even much more important today, as was noted yesterday. Thank you, Margot, very much. We will go back to you to hear more about what France did in terms of protection of women in prostitution also. But I would like to continue with Eurojust, Joanna van Nieuwkerk, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Like we discussed with Nenad, and this was something raised yesterday, the levels of prosecutions are rather low. This is something we see throughout the whole EU. We see this in the Baltic Sea region also. The number of victims recorded increasing while prosecutions are decreasing. So when it comes to supporting member states, what can Eurojust do to support member states in, you know, cracking down on prostitution networks, organized crime, and so on? How can you help them?
Thank you very much, Eddie. I take the opportunity to thank the Swedish Presidency to organize this event. I'm very, very honored to be here today to be part of these discussions and to bring our rich experience of Eurojust of more than 20 years in assisting all the member states in fighting organized crime and human trafficking. Why such a low number of prosecution? We tend to believe that one of the reason is the lack of cooperation sometimes, coordination between the states. This is a cross-border crime. We hear there are so many legislation and differences in this legislation, and going even to the human trafficking offense, we have harmonized the definition of human trafficking, but the way we implement it is sometimes not easy to coordinate our efforts, because we still see at Eurojust that the same facts committed by the same suspect against the same victim is qualified in one country as human trafficking, in other is forced prostitution or coerced prostitution, pimping, all kinds of names, and this is where Eurojust can help. We bring prosecutors from all the member states and outside Europe to sit at the same table and discuss in their own language about their legal system, about how do they qualify this fact. We help them to trigger investigation because we exchange information. Each country is only a fragment of the criminality, and probably the countries of origin of victims are in a position which is less favorable, because they might have a victim coming back home and reporting a crime, or the member of the family reports a crime which is not happening in their country. Everything is happening somewhere else, in one or possibly 2, 3, 4 countries in the European Union. This is a very complex crime. Victims and suspects are moving around within your jurisdiction, and very quickly, very fast. And the judicial cooperation is slow because it involves a lot of formalities. This is where Eurojust helps to bring together the practitioners to discuss what is the most effective way. And Eurojust encourages each and every country to contribute to the gathering of evidence, because if we resort to only formally request each and every time we need more information, we are too slow. The traffickers will be faster, and the evidence will not be there. Demand is very important. Legislation. We are not confronted so much at Eurojust because this is more the trafficking offense that it is discussed. But we did hear a few months ago, I was in a case of human trafficking for labor exploitation, where one of the countries would open a separate file to investigate the 90 persons who would employ the victims of forced labor. So it is happening, and we discuss it at Eurojust. We put everything on the table. So we encourage them to go, first of all, for police exchanges. So want to set the scene and to also exchange information with Europol, to identify more links, to identify the suspects, the victims, to dig into the criminality. And when the scene is set, to come for the judicial problems. Do we have an overlap? Who is going to prosecute whom, and for which crime? Do we have problems here? Do we have to transfer proceedings? Do we have to discuss the joint action day when we need to go and arrest the suspects? What will happen on that day with the victims? We discuss it at Eurojust. Do they need protection on the day? Are they practicing prostitution in the streets? How will they be announced? Who is going to be there for the victims? I would like to speak about the joint investigation teams, because we are recommending as much as we can that when complex investigations are starting in different member states, such a tool for cooperation is probably one of the most useful to cooperate. It creates the possibility to plan together, decide, divide responsibilities. So have a commitment, a shared responsibility, not only on executing what someone is asking you, another judicial authorities, but to actively gather the evidence, decide, act, and be successful. The gathering of evidence, it has to be done together, and the decisions. We think that financial investigations are also very important to go hand in hand, not only to be able to freeze and confiscate the proceeds of crime, but also, first of all, to identify who is involved. By following the money, you will see who sends the money from which countries and to whom. You identify the network, the victims. And that's very important. I think a greater focus on victims leads to a greater increase of prosecutions.
Thank you. Let's get back to you also. We're just finishing the first round. Thank you very much. We've heard from you and Nenad from your macro perspectives, and this is why we wanted also your perspectives here. You also repeat what Nenad from Europol touched upon. Differences in legislation. Yes, there is a harmonized human trafficking legislation. It's, however, implemented and understood differently, depending on which countries we're talking about. But I still note, which several of you have mentioned here in this panel, the legislations closely related to the human trafficking sphere, if you will, is regulated very differently. It looks very different in the member states. You mentioned forced prostitution, pimping, knowing use, and so on. And one would assume that this also affects this variety of, national contexts, how and when law enforcement also collects evidence. If there's no reason to suspect a crime, I would then assume that no evidence will be collected at the early phase. So I think this is interesting. And in the middle of this, demand is still important to counter. But on the note of different legislations, I will soon continue with Cyprus, but I just wanted to note, yesterday we discussed the knowing use quite a lot and the effects versus non-effects it may have, that type of legislation. But before moving on to Cyprus, who has a very interesting newer legislation that you will tell us about, I just wanted to ask Janna, connected to how you can access the women in prostitution. What's your take on the knowing use from a police perspective in Sweden?
Well, I mean, first of all, the equivalent of knowing use in Sweden would be negligent rape. And we have one case like that since 2018 when that legislation was implemented, which says a lot about how hard it is to prove, right? But if we compare with our neighbors, Finland, they have since around 2016, 11 cases of sex purchase. They have what you would then call the knowing use, that you would have to know that the person is under exploitation or trafficking to be convicted for sex purchase. 11 cases since 2016. We have, since 2018, 1,868 cases of sex purchase. And they have all been committed in the framework of procuring or trafficking for human beings, which means that if we didn't have that tool to punish for buying sex, then they would have all gotten away with it. So I think this is an important number to keep in mind.
Thank you, Janna. And on that note, let's continue to Eleni from Cyprus, from the police. You introduced a very interesting legislation which criminalizes the use of sexual services. I'm sorry, I know this is a sensitive way of framing it, but I'm sticking to the legal definition. In your legislation, using the services of a victim of sexual exploitation is a crime, and the legislation has removed this knowing use aspect in Cyprus. The reasonable suspicion condition is no longer there. Can you tell us more about how Cyprus is currently addressing demand, also thanks to this new legislation?
Of course. Thank you, Eddie, for your question, and many thanks to Swedish Presidency for organizing this fruitful conference, full of insights for experts. I would like to share with you the experience of Cyprus police at the implementation of the legislation concerning criminalizing of the demand. Many factors contribute to the harmonization of state with the international obligation in order to eliminate demand. One of them, perhaps the most important, is the existence of regulation legislation in each state which criminalize the use of services of trafficking victims. Law enforcement authorities have the responsibility to prosecute perpetrators before the court in order to be punished with severe penalties according to law. Here we have to point out that the existence of legislation, the proper implementation of the legislation, and the imposed of strict penalties are the key words to achieve this tremendous goal of combating demand. The criminalization of the demand in 2019, year of amendment of our legislation, has been widely projected by the media with particular attention to the ongoing operation carried out by the police throughout the Republic of Cyprus with the aim of prosecuting clients. However, since February 2020, COVID-19 has had a serious impact on trafficking cases, especially in the form of THP for the purpose of sexual exploitation. This was one of the most notable difficulties we face at the state of implementation of our legislation as law enforcement authority. The pandemic has encouraged perpetrators to seek out new forms to sexually exploit their victim using the internet. From police perspective, some of the basic action for the implementation of the legislation in order to fight the demand are primarily the evaluation of the information and the proactive investigation. I think that a colleague yesterday mentioned it. Of every aspect of concern the information prior to the police operation. The collection of testimony, not only from the victim, but also from others, is equally important at the final stage of any operation. In the world context, there are many bodies involved inside and outside the police, with which we are always in a close cooperation. Having in mind the victim-centered approach, the ultimate goal is to stop the cycle of demand in order to combat the exploitation of victims, limit the perpetrator's profits, and prosecute traffickers and clients. Important action, in addition to the implementation of legislation, are the awareness of public, the change of culture with the support of NGOs, and the cooperation between the state in the context of the exchange of information and best practices. Remarkable and crucial in this context is the contribution of the training programs that address to young people. It is noted that our efforts in this area of awareness continue through the multidisciplinary coordination group, in which both the police and the Ministry of Justice and Public Order in Cyprus participate. In this percept, since March 2021, we set up a hotline 1497 on a 24/7 basis exclusively for anonymous information regarding trafficking. On the same line, we set up a link on the website of Cyprus Police for the same goal. So our main goal is twofold: to convince people to abstain from committing this crime and to establish norms under which no one has the right to sexually exploit another human being. Summarizing the action of implementation, existing of legislation, proper implementation of the legislation, impose strict penalties, project by the media, the criminalization of the demand, proactive investigation, victim-centered approach, and training programs.
Thank you, and thank you very much. And for the information to the participants, Christiana Erotikroutou from the House of Representatives in Cyprus was supposed to attend, but unfortunately could not make it. So we're very thankful to get the police perspective here. But Eleni, I would follow-up question. Have you had any cases where you could exemplify how the legislation, the new legislation, has been supportive? Cyprus.
We have to be honest. It's very difficult to establish, to investigate cases with the clients. It's very difficult to gather evidence for this kind of cases. It's more easy to gather information regarding sexual exploitation. So far in Cyprus, we have 2 cases before the court pending trial. One case we have 1 victim of sexual and labor exploitation by their employer, and 5 clients as offenders. And the second one, very recent, the 17 years old student a girl, victim of sexual exploitation, and in this case we have one client. Maybe next month we have the final decision for the second case, and maybe we have the chance to inform you about this.
Yes, inshallah. Thank you. 2 cases on sexual exploitation where clients are also identified, but again, you stress the aspect of online exploitation. You mentioned the pandemic, but we see from other member states, also before the pandemic, this is a phenomenon that is moving more towards the online area.
Of course, our domino effects include and focus on the increasing of risk for clients, decreasing of the demand, and discourage perpetrators or traffickers for continuing their business.
Thank you very much, Eleni.
Thank you.
We'll move on to Ruth Breslin from Ireland. And Ireland adopted the equality model in 2017. And I wonder, you had a major shift quite recently then from the seller, who is now decriminalized, to the buyer, who is criminalized for fueling the demand and for exploiting the women. What does this shift mean for all these women in prostitution in Ireland?
Thanks for that, Eddie. And just to say thanks to all the organisers, I'm delighted to be here. That's right, 2017, Ireland adopted the kind of Irish version of the equality model. And to be very honest, this is very much inspired by the work of Sweden. It was probably about 10 years in the making in Ireland, and a lot of discussion and debate that kind of led up to the introduction of this legislation. And we did actually have a delegation from Ireland involving politicians and policymakers and civil society that came to Sweden to see the law in action. So since its introduction, SERP, the research programme I'm involved in, we've done a number of comprehensive studies on what's actually happening in the sex trade in Ireland. And I think in terms of the impact for the women, the impact for those selling sex, one of the really significant things that we've noticed is the kind of actually very positive, I suppose, influence of the law on the national police force in Ireland and the way that the police are policing the Irish sex trade. So they really kind of shifted their focus and shifted the burden, as you say, away from those who sell onto those who buy. But I suppose what they also did is adopt it as a starting point in terms of their policing. This understanding that everyone, regardless of their circumstances in the sex trade, everyone who's selling sex is a vulnerable person. And this is very much, I can kind of accept it because there's a consensus that there's such a large and significant level of organised crime involved in running the Irish sex trade, and also that there's extremely high levels of physical and sexual violence being committed against the women who are selling sex by sex buyers, by pimps, by traffickers and so forth. So what the law kind of led and encouraged the police to do was to take a more protective rather than their previous punitive approach to the women who are selling. But also, I think it was very interesting to see that there was a bit of a kind of effort to take a more uniform approach. So there were some police focusing over here on prostitution, and there were some police focusing over here on sex trafficking, and this work was united. It was united and drawn together because, of course, we know the two are inextricably linked. We know the trafficked victims are immersed in the same sex trade as other, including domestic victims of sexual exploitation. So drawing these strands together, but also the placement of that work. So that work has been placed in a unit that's essentially tasked with investigating domestic and sexual crimes, crimes essentially of a gendered nature. So this is a new approach for policing as well. So how has this benefited the women? We have seen the women who are in street prostitution, and there's only quite small numbers of women left in street prostitution in Ireland now, but they have described feeling more comfortable to report to the police, and particularly in relation to reporting violent crimes committed against them. They realise that the police are no longer their enemy, essentially, are no longer operating against them, but with them in a way, and taking that protective approach. We see the women who are indoors. And just to say, the sex trade in Ireland is predominantly in indoor locations and predominantly populated by young, vulnerable migrant women. And those women are reporting a certain greater level of comfort with the police, a certain level of comfort with the police checking in on them, doing what the police call welfare visits, checking on their welfare, sharing contact details. So women saying, well, actually, I have the contact details of this one police officer I met who seemed to be quite friendly and, is somebody that I would contact if I had a problem, if I had an issue. Something else that's really important, though, is that we've had some very, very successful outcomes in cases of those men who have perpetrated very significant levels of violence against women selling sex. So some of them are sex buyers operating on an individual basis, and we're talking about very serious levels of physical and sexual violence. And others are gangs, the organised crime gangs operating in groups and bursting into women's premises and attacking them, and weapons involved and so forth. Some very violent cases. And we've had very successful outcomes with quite a lot of police work to prosecute those individuals. And I think we just really feel that the legislation has paved the way for these kind of outcomes. Before, the women would not have been interested and would have been terrified to talk to the police, would have been terrified to give any kind of evidence. But with a more kind of, I suppose, gentle and cooperative and understanding approach, we have had many outcomes in terms of prosecuting those who are violent offenders in this context. So we've seen this overall shift in the burden of kind of criminal responsibility off the shoulders of those who sell and onto the shoulders of those who are buying and organising. So essentially those who are benefiting and profiting from the sex trade. It's not been easy for the police. I'm not going to suggest that for 1 minute. They themselves admit that they had to change their mindset. There was a kind of a cultural and a normative change within the police force itself. Before they were prosecuting the seller, now they must prosecute the buyer. They had to go on a journey with that. You know, they had to really figure out how to do that and how to do it appropriately and in a victim-centred and victim-sensitive way. So that all sounds great, right? But just to be clear, it is not all a bed of roses in Ireland. We have a lot of issues around implementation. We really do. I think it was mentioned yesterday that, you know, your implementation of this kind of legislation is only as good as your state wants it to be. And I think we really have a lot of work to do to encourage more political will around this. So yeah, there's certainly issues with implementation, particularly around tackling the buyer and tackling demand. But I suppose I also want to say something about the sort of conducive context that the law has created for other positive reforms that have kind of grown out of the introduction of the legislation in 2017. So one is the expunging of convictions for the selling of sex. So prior to 2017, we still had women who were being prosecuted and convicted for selling sex, particularly in street locations. A couple of years ago, our Minister for Justice said that she wanted to remove these convictions from the record. So, you know, women obviously carry those convictions around with them, and they can bar them from many things when they're moving on with their lives. So the idea was really in the spirit of the legislation to say that we've now accepted that those who sold sex are not criminals, you know, are vulnerable people, have experienced exploitation, and we need to remove those convictions. So that is in progress. It was also really interesting that because there was this recognition now that, you know, women are vulnerable in selling sex, vulnerable in the trade, there was a renewed interest in exiting supports for women. And actually we're involved at the moment with Rahama, who are represented here, the main frontline organisation in Ireland, in undertaking a big research study on the exiting process. So women's journey into prostitution, through prostitution and out the other side, and the exiting supports that they need. And finally, and I think really, really importantly, Ireland launched its third national strategy last year on violence against women. So it's our third national strategy on domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. But for the first time and ever in Ireland, this includes a formal recognition of prostitution and sex trafficking as forms of gender-based violence. So I think it's interesting because Sweden started with that. It started with this is gender-based violence and then introduced the law. We got the law first, and it took us 5 years to get to the point of accepting and having a general consensus that this is, you know, gender-based violence. So I think what this really shows is the equality model has created, as I said, this conducive context for some really positive, progressive change and development in the area of addressing the sex trade in Ireland.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for a very good overview. Ruth, you have also done a research analyzing the legislation in Ireland, which I think is very interesting. It's online. I recommend it. So we hear the police has been truly sensitized, especially when you compare to prior to the legislation. But I also note that there's a larger shift, not only within the police, who can now combine, you know, the prostitution units and the trafficking units can combine their efforts, but a political shift. It's this phenomenon, this crime, is perceived or interpreted today as a crime against violence against women. So it had a double shift in that sense. It's also been possible, and I think, Jana, you mentioned this as well, that certain police officers have been able, with the new legislation, when the women is not criminalized, been able to establish trustful dialogue which is very much needed in these complex issues. Thank you very much. The first round of questions is soon over. We will go to Joanna Bauer from El Librare. And I would like to ask you, we've heard yesterday how human trafficking was described, I think, as a two-front battle for typical countries of origin, in the sense that it needs to address trafficking taking place within the state, but also address the fact that women from that country may be pulled to typical countries of destination, depending on the legislation. How would demand legislation help victims from Romania? Demand legislations, for example, in Sweden or Germany or France? Please.
Thank you so much for the question, Eddie. And also, I just want to join my fellow panelists in thanking the Swedish presidency for actually including the topic of demand and prioritizing it. I think this is a very important message. And to go back to this division of countries of origin, destination, transit, right? I think that in the beginning, when this separation was made, the geopolitical situation looked very differently, and it was meant to be an aid to those of us who are working in the field of anti-trafficking. But right now, if we look at the current situation, I think that a lot of times this division ends up becoming a trap rather than a help. And to your point of discussing the situation in Romania, for example, Romania is a neighboring country to Ukraine, as all of you know. We have seen over 140,000 refugees who have come and settled in our country, and we have seen millions crossing the border, with some of them spending less than 48 hours in the country. So I think we're very much also a transit country. We're seeing a lot of third country nationals who are coming in, and in a way this whole mindset of are we a source country or are we a transit country, are we a destination country, this very much dictates the priorities, and it very much dictates the strategy. So I really want us to move away from this trap, as I said, of actually using the source, destination, transit country as a possibility to pass responsibility from one country to another, and just use it when it comes to the different ways it can help. It can help us. Also, I want to thank my panelists, because in a way, with everything that was said before, just during this panel and what was said yesterday as well, I think we have some themes, right? We have some themes when it comes to legislation. Demand, proactive identification, clear referral pathways. I think we need them standardized, and we very much need to figure out how to address them in a very unitary way. At the level of the union, what we want is not to create different spaces in which being exploited in that particular country becomes a luck factor. There are countries in which a victim of trafficking or a person who's being exploited in prostitution ends up being identified and referred to services, while in other countries that same victim under the same circumstances ends up being fined, which creates a lot of double standards in a union that's supposed to be equitable for everyone and for all victims of crime. So we really need to take that into consideration as well. Also, we need congruency when it comes to identification thresholds and indicators. We're at a great time in our history. We've heard that finally we're looking at revising legislation that leads the way at the European Union level, right? The anti-trafficking directive. It took us over 10 years to get to this point, and we must not miss this opportunity. I was looking at the 2011 text that actually talks about the directive and the European Union creating indicators at the level of the union when it comes to what does sexual exploitation mean, what does human trafficking mean. And it's still just an intention, although we're here 12 years later, right? So as we're looking at revising the indicators, we've heard from survivors, we've heard from law enforcement now, we've heard from prosecutors, we're hearing from practitioners. There is a huge need to actually understand how European regulation can help standardize the national frameworks when it comes to referral pathways, when it comes to legislation on demand, and when it comes to indicators and identification thresholds. and assistance to victims, which is another point that was made here. And I love the connection between how do we make sure that in our legislation for demand we include exit services and we include the path to assistance that's very clear, and it's not conditioned by cooperation with law enforcement or anything else.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I very much recognize this discussion, and you make a very valid point that this wording of country of origin, destination, transit, not only is it inaccurate when we sometimes describe some countries, but it can also limit us. We also discussed yesterday where I think you made a good point saying that talking about countries of destination and origin and fixating on that can also imply that it's not a shared responsibility, or that victims in countries of destination are best helped or sent back to the country of origin and they take care of it and so on. So I think this is a very good point. But also know that use the word proactive identification. I think this is a very good wording in this setting, and how legal frameworks in Europe can help countries to standardize and harmonize these steps to achieve particularly that, or also that, proactive identification. Thank you very much. We have completed our first round of questions. We started a bit later. I'm looking at the hosts of this event. Can we prolong it 5 minutes or so? Yeah, that's okay. I will open the floor for you to comment on each other, but before that, I would like to, Cyprus gave us a practical kind of example of how a case can use the national legislation, prostitution legislation in this case, to detect or prosecute organized crime. And I know, Anneli, from Sweden, there is a very known case you've been involved with or leading the prosecution in that has attracted quite a lot of attention. Do you mind briefly going through the case for us? I think this case is rather interesting for you.
Yes, Jana mentioned it. Thank you. It's the one case we have in Sweden of negligent rape of a sex buyer. And we all know that women in prostitution are very exposed to all kinds of violence, threats, rapes, and other crimes. So I got this case. It was a young Romanian girl. She had just turned 18 when she was trafficked from Romania to Sweden. And I'm sure you all know about the lover boy syndrome. This is a classic lover boy case. She lived under very poor conditions in Romania. She didn't have any family of her own. She lived with her boyfriend and his parents, and they had a 6-month child, even though she was so young. And she was abused and controlled by the boyfriend and her family. And then the lover boy shows up in expensive cars, promising her a better life. He loves her, and they will start a life together. She just has to sacrifice a bit first, he says. And that is, he's found out that they can earn a lot of money by going to Sweden and selling sex. That means selling her. And he also has an older cousin who speaks English and who helps organize everything. So the three of them go to Sweden. She knows she will be selling sex, but she thinks it's for a limited time. The proceeds of this, the sex she's selling, will go to their future so that they can live together with her son. And the minute they come to Sweden, she told me in court, he stopped talking to me. And she quite soon realized that this was not a love affair, it was a setup. And same day as they arrived in Sweden, there was an ad posted on one of these sites, you know, sextjejer.com, which is very big in Sweden, with photographs of her and the services she offered. And there was all kinds of services. She said in court that she thought she would be selling normal sex, the kind of sex she had with her boyfriend. But in this ad, you can see that she offers everything 24/7. So she's available every day, all times of the every hour. And she didn't speak any English. She had never been outside Romania. She had been to, you probably know this, she was from Craiova. And once she was on a school trip to Bucharest. That was her only trip in her life. So she didn't know anything. She thought she was committing a crime by selling sex in Sweden because the traffickers told her so. So she couldn't go to the police. She was basically shut in different apartments, selling sex to men all times of the day for over 3 weeks before the police found her. And I have 2 of the investigators here in the audience, and they've done a marvelous job on this case. Finally, the police found her, and traffickers were arrested. And after a short period when she wasn't sure she could rely on the Swedish police, she told the story. And it was clear to us that she had been abused and threatened by the traffickers to sell sex to these over 100 men. And so we started looking at the investigators started looking at the comments of this page, sextjejer.com. And we found one client of hers who'd visited her twice in 2 weeks. And after the second time he visited her, he posted a comment, a review on this website. And it's in Swedish. I've translated it for you here. It says, the positive impression from last time was changed into a dull experience, unfortunately. Her has obviously been working hard this last week, tired, unfresh, unconcentrated, dull new apartment. Suspected trafficking, nothing to recommend. And when I saw this, I thought, this isn't just purchase of a sexual service, this is rape. Because in that period, in July 2018, Sweden had passed a new law on sexual crimes, which states that the basis for all sexual acts should be voluntariness. The limit for what is criminal is if it's voluntary or not. So the one performing a sexual act with someone has to check if the other person is participating voluntarily. Otherwise, if I knowingly that this person is coerced to have sex with me, I'm committing a crime. And so that was the basis for my thoughts when I saw this review. And this was a new legislation. It had never been tested before, but I thought to myself, I'm going to try this. And I think that by posting this review, this person, he knows that she's not doing this voluntary. So we, the police and I, we worked on having a morning raid against this person. So we arrested him and we seized his mobile phones and things like that. And they had done a very impressive investigation connecting him through via IP addresses to him being the one actually posting the comment, and that he had withdrew money to pay for the sex. And it turned out when we seized his telephone that he had also filmed the act. So since he was in court saying, no, I don't think I actually had sex with her, I had to show the film he had taken of this. But the traffickers, they were committed for human trafficking and imprisoned, and also the sex buyer. The court found that he was guilty of negligent rape, not rape. This is a distinction in the Swedish law. It's a bit complicated, but if you... The court found that I couldn't prove that he knew, but he had reason to suspect that she wasn't performing the sexual acts voluntary. So he was committed to prison, 8 months instead of the normal sentence for purchasing of a sexual act, which at that time was very moderate fine. But he was also convicted for buying a sexual act. And that's, we were talking about the knowingly use yesterday. And I mean, the knowingly use, as Jana said, in this case is if you know this person isn't participating voluntarily, it constitutes rape or negligent rape. But even if you don't know that, or if you don't have even a suspicion, it's still a crime in Sweden, and that's, I think, the way we want it to be. And this is the only case we have since then, but I think the thing is, I had very good proof in this matter, so it's not that we don't want to use this, it's just that we have a very high threshold for the proof.
Thank you very much, Anneli, for this. This makes me think about what was addressed yesterday, but I think I always see that some buyers ignore the trafficking possibility when they do this act, while some maybe or likely are attracted to this factor also. And you can rate the woman online and so on afterwards. Yes, 1 second. Absolutely. The woman, according to these court documents, was in a period of 3 weeks exploited by around 100 men, as I understand, a very severe case. And how important it is that this case for those committing these acts, not just the traffickers, were convicted not only for the purchase of sexual services, but also negligent rape. It's a very interesting case, an important one, considering the new legislation. Before I get to, do you want to comment specifically on this?
Yes, I would just like to say
so Jana and then Margot, I will
that what Anneli just told us about really puts a finger on how many phases the so-called voluntariness comes into. I mean, there are so many ways to be forced or lured into prostitution, and I share also Nenad's what he was saying about the trend that we now see how traffickers lure their victims into a so-called business model together, where the victims sometimes obtain as much as 50% of the proceeds. But you have to ask yourself, what does she have to do for her 50%? And what the trafficker had to do for his 50%? Just put an ad, right? Or like another victim that is here in Sweden said, when she summarized sort of her experience, was I forced into it? No. Was I exploited? Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Jana.
Yeah.
We're touching about this stronger kind of law enforcement perspective here. But Margot, before we open the floor for the other speakers, can you just briefly, if possible, give us some sort of sense of what this new legislation in France, the equality model, means in terms of protection for the women in prostitution? In many ways, the French legislation is rather, more comprehensive in this aspect compared to other equality models. Can you give us an overview, please?
Yeah, we have protection of the victim. The system gives them social rights, residence permit rights when it comes to foreign victims. It can. There is also like sheltering, exit programs, and it can go until new identity for the victims of human trafficking. There is a specific protection for the women in prostitution and victims of human trafficking in general, even for other forms of exploitation. As soon as the hearing and investigation phase in front of the police services starts, we gave a 30 days delay to foreign nationals to think about if they want to cooperate with the police and the justice. And at the end of this 30-day delay, they can decide if they want to speak up and file a formal complaint or not. And if they do so, they engage in an exit program, in an exit path from prostitution. We also make it easier for victims of human trafficking to get residence permits. 1-year residence permits when they want to fully cooperate with the, I'm not sure cooperation is the right word, but like speak up and tell their story to police and justice services. 6 months for women who are victim of prostitution and who do not especially want to speak up but have severed all ties with the networks, the trafficking networks. And we also give resident permits for victims and their families when they do not want to speak up because there is a life-threatening or physical integrity-threatening risk. We also have specific measures at the stage of prosecution and hearing in front of the court, because the hearing can be held without the presence of the public. If the victim asked for it, it's as of right. They can also testify anonymously and by the mean of a video conference. So once again, their life and physical integrity is preserved. It is possible also for them to access, and this is the only kind of victim in France that have access to this kind of program. They have the same rights as what we call repentance in the French system. So it means there is physical police protection. They can have a whole new identity as well as their relatives and close, like children, husband, all the family can have a new identity and a new life, like a witness protection program. And it's the only category of victim that can beneficiate from this, I would say, very heavy change in the life, because it's a whole new life. Finally, it's also possible for the victims to domicile at the police station or the a lawyer's office or an association in order not to give their address in the proceedings. The protection of victim is also sheltering the victims and being able to give them shelter and a housing situation that is geographically distanciated from the networks that traffic them. So the Ministry of Justice works with several associations, and especially an association named AXE. They have several spots for human trafficking victims. It's people who specialize in the protection of those victims and that implement the exit program from prostitution. And finally, at the stage of the conviction, of course, human trafficking victims have a right to integral financial compensation that can be put before any other kind of fine or compensation that the offenders have to pay. One last thing is that we recently in French law created a system, it's a bit like the Italian system, social use of seized properties. The first case actually was used before it was into French law. We used the Italian law because it was an Italian building that was seized and that was used to shelter victims of human trafficking. So the goods we seize from, now it's possible in the French law, we seize from human traffickers can be used to actually protect victims of human trafficking.
Thank you, Margot. And I think it's very impressive to see this conscious decision to not adopt just an equality model and then hope that the rest will, kind of manage by itself, meaning the rest, the victimization and the aftermath of the exploitation. So it's very interesting to see that this was a combination in France. And resident permits is something we see countries are struggling with in the sense that it's very difficult to obtain longer than just a few months. So thank you for that.
Just one last comment. We're trying to make it easy for the victims to speak up because it's important for them, but it's also important for the investigations, because without the word of the victims, we can do phone tappings, we can do data capture, but it's not as strong. And in some cases where we had, for example, in Nigerian networks, police services and associations worked a lot to help victims speak up, and it gave us the opportunity to have very high sentences for forced abortions, human trafficking and rape, and it amounted until, I think, 19 years of imprisonment, which is very high for human trafficking in France.
Thank you. We will, as we're running out of time, we will move on to any questions from the audience. But quickly, Joanna, do you have any remark on what was said here?
Yeah, I think we've heard this yesterday as well, but we keep talking about knowing use, and it's almost like this mythological creature, right? There's sightings in every state, and we keep hearing the story about the guy who posted on the forum, the guy who was caught with his pants down, and the victim was clearly a minor. We all have our stories. We heard about Germany with the one conviction, and we must realize that if we're trying to legislate knowing use, what we're trying to legislate is morality in people who don't care about these things. We see that clients do not care about this. And then if we go back and we say, no, we're going to make it law, that's not going to change it. Meanwhile, we should legislate protection for victims, which actually the equality model does.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Juana. Do we have any questions from the audience here? Yes? And from now on, I leave it up to the host to stop the Q&A session. We have a question here in the middle, Iluta from Latvia.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Iluta Lāce from Latvia. Martes Centers on daily basis. Also, we work with victims of trafficking and gender-based violence, and we also strive for equality model in Latvia. I have a question to those that are investigators and police. How do you practically catch sex buyers? Because this is a message that our police cannot understand in a way. They say we need them with, as you, with pants down or something, but like some tools, some ways, how you, in Ireland, in France, in Sweden, what is your method to catch them?
Thank you. Relevant question. Jana, do you have a...
Yes, I mean, there are many different ways, of course, to focus on the crime. But as we speak now, for instance, there is a joint action going on in Sweden. So in many different regions throughout the country, as we speak, officers are out there visiting apartments and brothels. So our Sex Purchase Act enables us to visit these apartments. We are entitled to do that because we must make sure that the women selling sex there are right and to try to catch sex buyers. So that's the way we do it. And that's how we build our cases.
Any more questions? I saw several hands. Yes, and there. Let's start here, I think, and then we'll give you the floor for sure.
Yes, my name is Malaika Orengo, founder of Footprint to Freedom and a member of Beyond Survivors, cluster under Child 10. First, I would like to thank you all for your work towards leading survivors to justice, as a survivor myself. This is just a remark on my side. I know the legal practitioner and the justice system are doing a lot in supporting survivors attain their justice, but the process is traumatizing. In all the entities that you are talking about, you're just focusing on justice. But what does justice really mean to a survivor? The process of us identifying or becoming the witness is very exhausting, painful, and at the long run, it seems the government gets the number, we convicted 20 people, but what about the one who was in that courtroom? I think there should be more needs to improvement in trauma-informed legal process. At the same time, there is still lack of long-term support for post-conviction. What I see with survivors that I've been working with, especially, you know, as human trafficking is, a gang-related crime, that they become witnesses, but at the same time, they have to suffer long-term consequences of what is going to do for their children and their families. So it's a remark, but also a question to you. What measures have you put in place to make sure that survivors who become witnesses in the legal proceeding have long-term protection, not only for themselves, to their family members who have been also been pointed on by the gang traffickers? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very relevant remark. Does anybody want to comment on, is this something you see, for example, in these criminal investigation and processes, this very real risk of traumatization or re-traumatization even. Anneli.
Yes, I agree with you. We could do much more. And from the Swedish side, we have an investigation, which Anna Skarhed is the head of, that myself and Jana is a part of, that is to investigate whether we could do more for the exit programs for victims of human trafficking. So we're looking at it.
Thank you. Thank you, Malaika. We have one final question, I think.
One
please.
final?
Yeah.
Make it short.
Yeah, excuse me, I announced several times that it's not a question but a comment, and I ask for your indulgence. Sorry, I'm late. I'm trying to make it as quick as possible. Mr. Chairman, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to express my appreciation to the Swedish Presidency and the Council of the European for making it possible to have this important exchange with experts and stakeholders committed to the fight against trafficking in human beings. It is a very timely meeting since many of the global developments over the last couple of years, such as the COVID pandemic or the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, have a tremendous impact on human trafficking and our strategies and capacities to fight this gross violation of human rights. The project of the EU directive amending Directive 2011 on combating THB constitutes a significant step forward in our fight against THB and is supported by Austria. In this respect, both Commissioner Johansson and the Swedish Presidency's support for this initiative were crucial to give this new directive a powerful launch. Without any doubt, it will enhance Member States' efforts to prevent and combat human trafficking more effectively. Austria has been a frontrunner in combating THB for many years now. The goal of the National Task Force against THB, which I'm currently presiding, is constant development and improvement of the policies against human trafficking. The backbone structure of our work is a comprehensive national action plan featuring 109 different measures, and this is complemented by strong international cooperation with the EU and its member states, with international organizations, and with police and the NGO networks. Each year, on the occasion of the EU Anti-Trafficking Day, the task force organized the Vienna Conference on combating THB in order to allow international experts to exchange their views and raise awareness with the public. While appreciating Sweden's overall efforts on combating human trafficking, let me highlight that each and every member state has chosen a specific approach on prostitution. Like many other EU countries, Austria has in place a safe regulatory system. The implementation, maintenance, and further development of this system is not a product of inertia or indifference, but of a thorough and considerate monitoring of the sex service sector by the Austrian government. The system ensures visibility of sex workers, legal workplaces, and regulated working conditions. It also allows for outreach work by counseling centers, surveillance, and trust-building measures by the police. However, since the situation is constantly evolving and there is always room for further improvement, a permanent working group of relevant actors such as police and counseling centers has been established, which continuously monitors the situation of sex workers and evaluates problems in order to develop recommendations for policy stakeholders. Expert opinion states that an illegal market increases the risk of human trafficking and impedes victim protection and support. Police and counseling centers lose access to sex workers, which makes it more difficult to identify potential victims and offer support, protection, and counseling. While human traffickers operate more freely, thereby increasing the risk of exploitation and violence, state authorities lose influence on working conditions and on location where sex work takes place. As a result, sex workers are forced to provide the services in the hidden, which increases their isolation and dependence on others, and consequently, their vulnerability and danger of exploitation. The COVID restrictions in Austria, which also included prohibition of sexual service during lockdowns, have proven for a limited period of time the above described negative effects of driving the market into illegality. It has to be noted that in other working areas with a high risk of THB, such as 24-hour care, construction or agriculture, instruments of repression are not discussed. Instead, there are efforts to strengthen control and rights. Therefore, also for the area of sex work, specific regulations are needed in order to reduce vulnerability and ensure protection. A clear distinction between sex work and THP is necessary to take targeted action against THP. In the light of the issues mentioned, I finally want to stress that while Member States take a different approach on their way to achieve their goals, we all have a common ground to combat and prevent this severe crime, as well as to protect victims. THP is a transnational crime and cannot be defeated by isolated countries. It cannot be defeated by countries divided over issues. Winning over THP is only possible when we unite our capacities and strengthen coalitions and cooperation with other member states, other relevant stakeholders and institutions within the EU and beyond. Thank you and for your indulgence.
Thank you, Austria.
Thank you, Austria. I think
yeah,
we're finalizing due to time.
Now, unfortunately. I'm sorry for that.
Like to respond to that.
Okay, of course, someone can respond.
So I would like to respond to that comment and also to just pick up on something that Helmut said earlier about the astonishing number of women in prostitution in Germany. I think something we're not talking about enough is scale, that this is a scaling issue. Okay, so if we compare Sweden to Germany, controlling for the differences in population size, Germany has a sex trade 40 times larger than Sweden. I don't know the numbers for Austria, but I'd say they're probably quite significant. Netherlands has a sex trade 9 times larger than that of Sweden. The decriminalisation model, the full decriminalisation model, is often proposed for Ireland. It's the model in use in New Zealand. We have a population size the same size as New Zealand. Their sex trade is 5 to 6 times larger than ours. We know that within every sex trade, there is going to be a proportion of individuals who are trafficked, who are exploited, in my view, a very high proportion. The larger the sex trade, the larger the number who are exploited. So I think we need to be talking more about these scaling issues. What does a full legalised model look like? It looks like an explosion in the size of the sex trade, therefore an explosion in the exploitation. Thank you.
And real quick, just on the specific case of Austria, I'm really happy to hear that there's such a willingness for collaboration, because last time that I visited Austria, and specifically one of the parking lots where prostitution was legal, you had a lot of women from the same area, in the Craiova area, who were actually there saying that they're working with their husbands or boyfriends. The indicators for trafficking were all there. It was extremely relevant that if there were proactive identification, those women would have been placed in protection systems and not regulated for work or anything else. But maybe we can continue the discussion, since there's such willingness to collaborate on and work on this, because there's definitely room there for improvement and working together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anna. Looking at the hosts, and I see a wish to finalize this discussion, so don't attack me. I'm just a messenger. Thank you, speakers, for a very interesting panel. I hope this was interesting to you listening to this. I think what we take with us is that there's no conflict between strong law enforcement perspective, prosecuting these crimes, which are very serious, but also having the victim perspective. And with a victim perspective, not in theory, but in concrete tools and measures that victims can utilize to not be re-traumatized during the process. I very much thank you, Malaika, for your intervention, but let's not make it just something we compliment survivors about, but translate this into concrete practice. Thank you, all of you, for contributing to this discussion. Thank you.
We're going to have a short coffee break, so we will be back at 11:40. Thank you. So, everybody could just make it into the room and take your seats. Yes, I think we have about everyone here in place. So, I am still Charlotte Eklund Rimsten. Most of you recognize me from yesterday. And I would like now, for this final segment, to welcome the panel members for this conversation on the equality model as a means to changing norms in society and put an end to trafficking for sexual purposes. So, a warm welcome first to Jonathan Mackler, Executive Director of CAP International. Welcome up. Åsa Regnér, Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and Deputy Executive Director of UN Women. Welcome. Lydia Osifus Festus, Coordinator of Acción contra la Trata, Spain. Welcome.
Hola, mucho gusto.
Rika Safrani, President of the European Women's Lobby. Maria M. Dmitrieva, Democracy Development Center, Ukraine. And last but not least, Malin Björk, member of the European Parliament and the Committee on Civil Liberties. And we will also have a video message from Juan Fernando López Aguilar, also a member of the European Parliament and chair of the Committee on Civil Liberties. So we will get back to that. Now, throughout this conference, we have heard about legislative and other models to address the demand that fosters trafficking for sexual purposes, and how they can be used in the fight against this heinous crime. Sweden has had the legislation for a long time, and we have seen significant changes in the norms concerning prostitution during this period. The legislation has a strong support in Sweden. Buying sex is not socially acceptable here, and there is a general understanding in society that prostitution is exploitation and a form of gender-based violence. For this last panel, we would like to explore this subject even more. How can the equality model contribute to change norms in society? And how can this play into the fight against exploitation in prostitution and trafficking for sexual purposes? So we have a highly experienced panel for this segment, and you all have unique insights on this issue. I would like to begin by turning to Jonathan Mackler. Your organization, CAP International, has set up a number of criteria as regards the equality model. And we would be very interested to hear you describe and elaborate a bit on them, and please also explain your organization's work and why a wider implementation of the equality model is important from your perspective. And I know you have a presentation, so I will give you the thingy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the Swedish government for organizing this very powerful conference and overall for its support to the global abolitionist movement. So yes, I represent CAP International, the Coalition for the Abolition of Prostitution. We are currently an organization made of 35 grassroots and survivors-led organizations operating in 28 countries. And last year, collectively, our member organizations have supported more than 17,000 prostituted persons, overwhelmingly, of course, women and girls. So on the ground, what we observe and what we hear when we listen to the testimonies of women and girls who are or who have been in prostitution, when we analyze the studies made by researchers and lawyers, and when we listen to the experiences made by social workers and the feedback from psychologists, we observe that first, prostitution is neither sex nor work, but constitutes it in itself a form of violence against women. The repetition of sexual acts without physical desire, but instead experienced as a consequence of financial need, inequality, or as an exploitation of vulnerability, constitutes sexual violence in and of itself. The vast majority of the prostituted persons have suffered from violence, often sexual, before entering prostitution. Most of them are also victims of many forms of violence while in prostitution: physical, verbal, sexual, psychological. There is no free and forced prostitution. The sexual act obtained by sex buyers in prostitution is in reality always coerced. Coerced either by the physical coercion of traffickers or pimps, or by the socio-economic coercion that pushes the most vulnerable women and girls into prostitution. There will be no equality between women and men as long as men think that they can buy access to women's bodies. Prostitution is part of a long patriarchal tradition of making women's bodies available for men's benefit. Prostitution is based on multiple forms of inequalities: men's domination over women, rich over poor, north over south, majority groups over minorities. Women from minorities, poor, migrant, and marginalized groups form nearly the totality of the prostituted persons all over the world. And finally, prostitution is also a violation of human dignity, and as it is defined by international human rights law, the UN 49 Convention of the 2nd of December 49, adopted by the General Assembly, states in its preamble that prostitution and the accompanying evil of the trafficking in persons for the purpose of prostitution are incompatible with the dignity and worth of the human person. So, yeah, for us, thank you. For us, prostitution raises actually a simple question to our societies. Collectively, what choices do we want to make? What options do we want to offer, to provide to the most vulnerable among us? Are we accepting this unlimited exploitation of their bodies as an acceptable means of survival? Or do we decide to work collectively in order to try to provide a safety net, preserving their rights and dignity? No? Okay. Oh yeah, all right. Certain countries have decided to try to implement the first option by implementing a regulatory approach, or that we could call the sex work approach. We can talk about Germany, about New Zealand, about the Netherlands, about Turkey also. So by choosing this option, they have legalized prostitution, reframed it as sex work, and made a legal distinction between a so-called free prostitution and a so-called forced prostitution. This approach considers prostitution as a form of work as any other. It implies the legalization of sex buying, pimping. Pimps are being recognized as intermediaries or managers, and assimilates the sexual act as a service, which is not. It gives a transactional value to sex, which becomes a currency like any other. As a very concrete example of that, in the Netherlands today, it is legally possible and accepted for a driving instructor to propose a sexual act as a means of payment to the students that are trying to get their driving license. It even has a name. It's called a ride for a ride. In theory, prostituted persons are given, in this model, an identification number and must undergo regular health checks. And of course, this approach also legalizes brothels. In practice, wherever it has been applied, this approach has had disastrous effects. It has normalized the purchase of sexual acts and the objectification of all women, leading to an increase in male demand for sexual acts as well as sex tourism. This has led to an explosion of the prostitution market and thus an increase in human trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation. Above all, far from improving the situation of victims, it has only strengthened the hold of pimps and traffickers on them who can then hide behind a legal facade. And finally, legalizing prostitution does not change the violence of the sexual acts obtained in prostitution. If we look at the result of this model in Germany, now referred to in European media as the brothel of Europe, prostitution, which is legal, has been completely legalized in all its aspects. And the German government levies taxes on the activity of women in prostitution. So actually, under international law, the German state, by making profits, by exploiting the prostitution of another person, legally speaking, behaves as a pimp. Trafficking is penalized by Article 232 of the Penal Code, but sex work has been legalized since 2002. So there are 83 million residents in Germany, an estimate of 400,000 prostituted persons. Among them, only 23,000 prostituted persons asked for the sex worker legal status in 2021. And from what we know, not because it grants rights, but because it was a requirement to be able to work kind of in brothels. It is an estimated figure that 95% of them are foreigners, but only 330 women have been identified as trafficking victims per year over the last 6 years. So 400,000 prostituted persons, most of them, the totality of them foreigners, but only 330 of them, as an average, identified as victims of trafficking every year. Around 2,300 legal brothels, and 1 million men buying sex every day. Among them, apparently, in the last 7 years, as it was said yesterday, there has been one sex buyer who has been arrested. That's the efficiency of the knowing use approach. I will pass. I could say much more things about Germany and about Netherlands, but I want to show the contrast with countries that have adopted the equality model or the abolitionist model. So other countries have adopted this model, in particular Sweden, of course, that opened the way, then France, Iceland, Norway, Canada, Israel, Ireland, Northern Ireland. The model is based on 5 pillars: the full decriminalization of all prostituted persons, the recognition of a status of victim for prostituted persons, opening the access to an exit pathway in order to empower women to leave prostitution for good. This includes protection from the pimps, covering basic needs, psychological support, and socio-economic reintegration. I must say that these exit programs are their access are unconditional, and in particular in France, you do not need to testify against your traffickers in order to have access to these exit programs. This is unconditional. Targeting the demand, which is key, and which is the root cause of prostitution and trafficking, by criminalizing the purchase of sexual acts, criminalizing all forms of pimping by adopting a comprehensive definition of it, including making any sort of profit from the prostitution of another person, and changing the mentalities and behaviors by establishing a national policy for prevention, education, and training, in particular of the youth, the men, and the police, justice, and social services. A few results of the first years of implementation of this law in France. So I wanted to show the the number of residents in both Germany and France to actually show that the population is comparable, so the situations are comparable. And we talk about neighboring countries. So we have an estimate of around 40,000 prostituted persons in France, so 10 times less than Germany. 0 legal brothel. 0 prostituted person arrested for being in prostitution, as an average of 2,500 before the adoption of the law. And that's very important because we are very often confused and on purpose confused with prohibitionists. But in France, this is the abolitionist law that decriminalized the woman in prostitution. Protection and reintegration. Around 800 women in prostitution have had access to an exit pathway. Among those accompanied by our member, 87% were in a stable job situation at the end of their exit pathway. This exit pathway is comprehensive. It includes a residency permit, access to financial support, access to housing support, psychological support, and training. Regarding the work of the justice, between 2016 and 2019, we have observed a 54% increase in proceedings against pimps and traffickers, and the volume of compensation received by victims has been multiplied by 7. And regarding the targeting of the demand, 8,000 sex buyers have been, around 8,000 sex buyers have been penalized in the country. Among those who attended a sensitization workshop, 90% of them declared anonymously that the workshop changed their perception of prostitution and that they would not buy sex again. We can choose to believe them or not, but the questionnaires are anonymous. And regarding prevention and sensitization, according to a survey we made in 2019, 3 years after the adoption of the law, 78% of the French people had a positive view of the law. 84% of 18 to 24 years old people were in favor of maintaining it, and 81% of women considered prostitution as a form of violence. So if we want, in particular at the European level, to target the demand and to really fight the systems of trafficking, the system of prostitution, we have to look at the systems and the approaches that really work. We have to compare the impact in Germany and in France. We have to compare also the impact in terms of normalizing the demand in Spain and in Sweden, for instance. In Sweden, it is estimated that 40% of men have already paid for a sexual act once in their lives. In Sweden, it is 9%. And it has a consequence, because prostitution is above all a market. So if we compare the size of the sex trade in Spain, in Germany, and in France, you see the results of the different impacts, of the different approaches taken, right? Of course, there are people, there are lobbies, there are pressure groups that really regret that that there is a difference of 10 billion euros to make between an abolitionist country and a regulatory country. But it's about the model of society we want to promote. Either we want to promote a society that tries to provide a safety net to the most vulnerable, either we decide that we want to live in a gigantic supermarket where everything and everybody can be purchased and sold. I would just end up this presentation by saying that, if we are honest regarding the impact, there is no debate. There is no debate on the way to take. So what we are calling for is mobilization, and we see 3 particular areas of mobilization. First, the UN. The UN is important, the international arena is important. On the 15th of December 2022, a resolution was adopted, a resolution on trafficking in women and girls was adopted in a plenary session of the UN General Assembly, calling upon member states to take action with the view of, to take action to reduce the demand, to reduce with the view of eliminating the demand. And in these actions, it included legislative and punitive measures. It is very important that the UN, and in particular the UN agencies, are recalled to their obligations, in particular UNAIDS and UN Women, because we see stances being taken by these UN agencies that show that they consider they can completely emancipate themselves from their mandate, from the sovereignty and the willingness expressed by member states in the General Assembly. And so you cannot have the member states calling for reducing with the view of eliminating the demand on the one hand, and UNAIDS, for instance, taking a stance to decriminalize and legalize the sex trade. This is not compatible. And second, the EU. We have 2 directives now that are being discussed. We have talked about the trafficking directive. I mean, we see that the knowing use is inefficient. It's even written, actually, in the working document that accompanies the draft of the directive, that it is very difficult for, to prove that the sex buyer knew. And so it is very difficult to convince, to condemn the sex buyer under this approach. And it is also, it has also resulted in 2 convictions in Finland and 1 in Germany. So why the Commission is trying to mainstream a model that has led to arresting 3 sex buyers in 2 countries in the last 7 years, while there is a model that has allowed to arrest 8,000 of them in 1 country. And then there is a directive of violence against women that currently includes provisions that allow the penalization of the purchase of a sexual act and the penalization of the exploitation of the prostitution of another person. We really call for the civil society, the abolitionist champion states, and all of us in the room to mobilize in order to win these provisions, to maintain these provisions, and to mobilize on the UN level, the 2 EU directives all together. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. It is so useful to see the numbers and hear the comparisons between the countries with different models. And I think that technicians can help us to come back to the original picture there. Thank you. And you ended, Jonathan, with a few words on the international work and the international organizations, and a few words about the United Nations, which plays very well into our next panelist. Åsa Regnér, you have a broad international perspective on the prevention of violence against women and the involvement of men and boys in gender equality work. Sexual exploitation and trafficking in human beings for sexual purposes is a serious form of gender-based violence. What are your thoughts on the equality model as a means to changing norms in society and to put an end to trafficking for sexual purposes? And how can the United Nations be a forerunner in this? And what more can the United Nations agencies do to support the member states in targeting the demand? Please.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here. I think that this is a very refreshing space to be in, and I apologize that I wasn't here yesterday. The reason was that there was a big, important strategic meeting on humanitarian coordination within the UN, and unfortunately, the UN works more on humanitarian support now in different countries than ever. UN Women has just recently joined this group. Before we were not there, and I think the perspectives were also not as present as they should. And the issue we're talking about now is, as you know, a big part of what happens to women, and a form of exploitation that happens to women during humanitarian crisis in armed conflict, not least now during Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But I'm very happy to be here today. And also before I start, I want to thank Sweden. I saw the minister just came in. We had the honor to host her and all other delegations at the Commission on the Status of Women just recently. I also want to acknowledge the presence of the SRSG Pramila Patton, who has the mandate from the Security Council to work against war crimes, sexual violence as in armed conflict, and who has also spent considerable time in Ukraine, not least recently, to set up and help the government and the UN set up an action plan against all forms of violence against women in that context. So it is great to be here. So, since I was slightly attacked here, which actually made me think that it's refreshing to come back. You know, that happens very seldom when you represent the UN. It's said in other ways, but this is, I appreciate the frankness, and it made me think about my party political days. It gets me going, so this is what I think. I do think that the Swedish model and the equality model is very effective. And I do agree with everyone, obviously, that it seems to definitely be the best tool to encounter the exploitation and the abuse and the power that men get to exercise over women in this context. It seems to me that all evidence points to that. The United Nations, I think, honestly, is very clear when it comes to its standing against trafficking, and also it's seeing that as violence against women. Also, I totally agree with one of the speakers up here who said, or the moderator said, that nowadays demand is also what, as you pointed out, is an issue that we acknowledge is really a way of addressing this, because had we not had a demand, the business wouldn't exist, and this phenomenon wouldn't exist. And that today is not controversial and is also asked for. The issue is with different models around prostitution. That is the problem, let's say, that the United Nations has, that the European Union has, because member states have different models for legislation, and the UN cannot tell member states how to legislate in their countries. What the UN can do, however, is to show evidence, is to show models. We have a normative mandate, which is both about implementing international agreements, but also to show evidence shows this is experience in a country, this seems to work in the program we have in countries, this and that. And I think, to my mind, and that's why I felt attacked, but in a positive way. I don't mind that. I'm used to that. I seek issues and places where I can be. To my mind, UN Women actually does that. It is our role to show different ways of solving big inequality problems. And but I do think that a space like this, where the, so to speak, where we discuss from a certain perspective from the beginning, is quite unusual for UN civil servants. We come to spaces with 190 member states with very different views, or with big groups of NGOs with very different views on this. And I do see, and you mentioned examples of both EU member states and UN member states with very different views here. And actually, I believe we have EU experts here, but the Social Democratic group within the EU Parliament does not have one opinion even. And I think the conservative or liberal groups also not. So I see that the UN has a role to point to important and interesting evidence. But the UN cannot tell member states where to go. Member states can help the UN, donors can help the UN and say, this is something we think you should look into. This is interesting perhaps for programming and so on and so forth. I think that, as we always do in models for democracy development and so on, we push each other. We have prominent representatives from the civil society here, Taina and other colleagues who have the ungrateful job of writing, also calling out, telling us that what you said there wasn't very helpful, or what you didn't say there wasn't very helpful. I think that that is very helpful for us. So I think, as I have been a cabinet minister, and I was actually in cabinet when the legislation on sexual violence was put forward as one example. During my time in cabinet, we increased penalties for what's it called? Sorry, sexköpslagen, Act for Prostitution. We also, during my time, one reason for me to introduce the National Agency for Gender Equality was to work specifically on these issues, and I also wanted at that time to scale up different initiatives which have to do with both demand and what we call sometimes toxic masculinities, or also positive masculinities, in order to target prevention. So I personally have always been a big friend of the Swedish model and the equality model. I continue to be so, and in my EU meetings I have always told that this is the case, because otherwise I think you become not genuine in your meetings with people you meet. But the UN does not have a position on legislation nationally when it comes to prostitution. I think we can support such a development, and as I said, I think that evidence is a very important key there. I think from UN Women's point of view, you tell me how long I still have, but I think that it might be interesting to know what UN Women actually does in the countries where we are in order to address these issues in general. Obviously, in humanitarian settings, as I said, I think nowadays UN agencies rush to respond to trafficking and the risk of trafficking. I think we saw that in the case of Ukraine and Moldova. Not to say that everything was fantastic and that all the problems were solved, but it is certainly on everybody's mind nowadays. UN Women also does conflict analysis, humanitarian response plan analysis, to see what is actually happening to women and girls in a country where these issues are always included. We work on a daily basis in all the countries where we work, 80 countries in the world, obviously against violence against women. In many countries with masculinities and men's role when it comes to violence against women and issues such as demand. We work, of course, on livelihoods to women, economic empowerment, and when we ask women, and we do that all the time, what do they see in conflict zones where the risk increases for these situations as their most important need, almost always they would answer economic empowerment. I want my own income to be able to facilitate for myself and my children and decide what happens to me. If I have my own income, I can make those decisions and I become less vulnerable, and so do my children. We also work obviously together with other UN agencies on sexual and reproductive health and rights, and perhaps most importantly in support of local women's organizations and feminist organizations who very often have this agenda. They are today heavily underfunded. They are also increasingly experiencing shrinking space. And as we know, women's rights defenders face harassment and even threats, and sometimes are even killed for their advocacy, and it's a big task for UN Women to support them. I wanted perhaps also to say that in the panel here before, many issues were raised around legislation, different forms of legislation, but what we observe is that training of the judicial system and the different parts of the judicial system is very important to address. And we have learned also in Sweden, I know, that you have to repeat that training. You cannot do it once in a generation and think that it sticks. You have to repeat it. So I think that from UN Women's point of view, it is important for us to, as I said, work systematically to show evidence and data. We, I think, should I can certainly see spaces where we can speak out louder about that. I think also that UN Women can work to use perhaps more systematically the fact that the demand issue has become more common ground and be more strategic around that. And I think also that what UN Women does is to spread examples of what functions in countries, and for example, the Swedish legislation on consent that we heard about earlier here today is one such example. There are others in the world. But I also believe that others, civil society is working very, very hard in this area. I'm very grateful for that, we are. But I think donors can actually be even clearer and say that this is something we expect from you, or we would like to support you going forward. We hear a lot of messages, humanitarian aid, climate response, big issues in relation to women's rights, very important ones, but perhaps not so frequently to be very clear, this particular issue when it comes to legislation on prostitution. And I think that it is there could be space for that. And I also would like to encourage you that you continue to encourage us to take on this issue and be braver, because that is heard and it is seen. And when pressure comes from the outside, things certainly happen on the inside. So I think that is very important. So thank you for for your comments, and most of all for your hard work. And I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Åsa, and it's at least encouraging to have you in the United Nations advocating for these important issues. And I will just turn to my colleagues and ask for some kind of sign if we have until 1:15. Do we have until 1:15? No? 12:15? No. Let's just say we have another 15 minutes on the panel. Yeah. Good. Then I turn to Ms. Osifo Festus, speaking from your own experience as a survivor of trafficking. Do you have any special thoughts on different legislative and preventive models when it comes to the reality for those being exploited for sexual purposes. What is and what is not useful for the victims of trafficking? And can you see any differences in how the victims are treated, for example, by sex buyers or by law enforcement? And what are the most pressing needs to meet to prevent exploitation? Lydia, please.
I want to say good afternoon to everyone, and I want to say a big thank you to the Swedish government for having this kind of conference where I can be here to talk and my voice to be heard for all African women and children that have been trafficked in prostitution that couldn't talk about it. It's a great opportunity, and I want to thank you for inviting me here. I'm a survivor of prostitution. I've not been able to talk about it for a very long time, but given my face, but I do little conference, but this one is very big. So first time I'm in a big conference like this, so I'm kind of going to be a little nervous, but I'm going to bring out something. Okay, in Spain, where I live, prostitution is neither legal or illegal. It's like a normal thing there, but they go about it. I stayed in Madrid for some time, for like 10 years, before I was changed my city to Navarra. Navarra is a small city in the northern part of Spain. You know, it's a town where they welcome immigrants, and so many immigrants are there. So when I got there, I was like, I want to help myself. The years I've been in Madrid, I could not be able to have any information about if traffic person, about your right or whatever it is, you know. So I was in Navarra 2017, and there's a place they call Atención de Mujeres, Attention for Women. So I went there, you know, I had my first chat with a social worker there, where I was able to talk about my story, and she was like, wow, you are a victim of trafficking. I said, yes. She said, okay. In Navarra, there's economic help for women that are trafficked, because they recognize them as, they recognize them that violence against them is a crime against women that were trafficked. So Navarra recognizes that when you have been trafficked, you have been prostituted, is a crime against your gender right as a woman. So I was given the help to come out of prostitution, because I was still in prostitution, because I had no document. There's no way I could work a legal job and earn a legal salary, you know. So she was able to put me in the program, and in 2 months, in 2 months, I was being paid. Okay, I said, okay, fine. I've been paid. What am I going to do? I'm not going to sit at home. I have to find information, you know. I got into Las Poderosas, Women in Power. It's a small group of immigrant women. We have different stories, not only women that were trafficked or women in prostitution. There are other stories there. We are like 13 nationalities there, 13 nationalities there, where we talk about what's happening to us. So our coordinator, Alicia, was able to make me know that I have rights as a woman. Being trafficked or being a normal person or being in prostitution before, you have a right. So through the process, I was able to know my right. I was able to, I went through the healing process with the psychologist, which I've never done since 10 years. I was able to go through the program, and I came out strong. There was a reference for me, Amelia Tiganus. She was a lady that came to one of the workshops and gave us information about how you can be able to talk about the way you were trafficked and you will be relieved from the pain, you know. I saw her talk about it without no tears in her heart. She was good. I talked to Alicia. I said, Alicia, please, I want to write a book. I want to write my story. She was like, Lydia, are you sure? I said, yes. Through that, we had this Libro Parasoya, Free to Dream. With my story on that book, at least we had like 12 women that came out to talk about how they were trafficked to Europe. And the measures I really want to put, I want to say that it can work to bring women out of prostitution. But we children, when we have kids, we have male children, we have female children. In Africa, let me say in Africa, we don't grow them with the same right. The male children are better than the female children, which is gender equality. So for prostitution to be abolished, for the woman body not to be violated, for a woman not to be looked as a toy for sexual satisfaction, I think we growing our children and in equal rights will make them understand that a female is like a treasure to you. She has the same right with you. She has the right to go to school. She has the right to have a better life. She will not be used for trafficking. How was I trafficked? I was like a sacrificial lamb for the family because I was grown out of poverty. My dad had 5 kids. So what will I do? I became sacrificial lamb. Okay, go to Europe, go and help us. But if I was a male, I wouldn't. They wouldn't sell me out. So growing children in the same equality will help us stop exploitation in women. And secondly, there's something I've been thinking. I don't know if the government can help us do it. You know, in school timetables, we have biology, we have geography, we have different subjects. If trafficking can be put as a subject in school timetables, where we can talk about it in schools, because we are trying to fight it now, because the younger generation are coming. So when you tell them about it in the early stage, that the male child should not look at the female child as something you can be bought with money for sexual pleasure, I think with that on the timetable for school, it will help us a lot to talk to these youngsters that are coming. And thirdly, the men that ask, that demand for sex, they are the main reason why exploitation is still available. Because they know with their money, they can buy sex and there's no fine, there's nothing that's going to happen, they can go away with it. So I know men, they like to protect their image. They like to protect their ego. Because when a man is being penalized for buying sex, I think he will be scared for the letter or his face not be shown on television that this man was hold for buying sex and he was paid and he's paying a fine for it. So I think when they are penalized, it will reduce exploitation in women, and women in prostitution will not be much. And if the demand is low, there will not be thriving markets for traffickers. It's because the market is still booming in Europe. That is why Africans, as we are talking now, they are traffickers ready to bring people into the European Union for market. So what I'm trying to suggest is that the abolition model should be put in effect, because if it's done earlier, I know it's not going to be 5 years programs to just go off, no. But in Pamplona, in Navarra, where I live, we don't see girls in the street. Because one, the government has helped them out of the street. The girls, they have information, and they are doing great works. Like I am. When I left Africa, I have no skills. I was trafficked here, okay, fine. But when I came to Navarra, through the help of Alicia, I have my skills now. I'm into a tailoring program, and I have my document. After 18 years in Europe, I got my document last year through this program. I wish I had information earlier, that there's where I can go, where my rights can be read to me, where I can be helped. I don't think I would have suffered that much. So I'm trying to appeal in this forum that information should be given to trafficked women and women in prostitution. Help, economic help is very important, because when you're telling a lady to go out of prostitution, she's going to feed, she's going to pay her bills, she's going to take care of her children. I'm a mother of 2 daughters. Without the help, what will I do? I'll still be in the street working. And I'm standing here because, not just because of my children, but because of many women that their voice could not be heard. Prostitution is a crime against women in every form. Many women end up being depressed. Many end up with long-time diseases that cannot be cured. They live with it. Many live with trauma. Many did not come out alive. So with my voice, I'm reaching out to every lawmaker in this place, every lawmaker listening to us on here. They should please let something be done and let this abolition system be put in effect so that we can start living a free, fair environment where a female child will not be looked at the street to pay sex for, where a female child will not be harassed because she's a female, where a female child will have the right to stand at the government place and talk and will not be dehumanized, will be a female gender. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lydia. That was very clear and very powerful We are very grateful to have you. Rika Safrani, the European Women's Lobby has a broad experience on working against sexual exploitation and trafficking for sexual purposes. I would like to ask you about your view on the equality model and why it has been important for you to support and promote the equality model. And you also have a presentation and you have the clicker, so please, Rika.
Thank you very much to the Swedish government for organizing this important event. We would very much like to thank for inviting the European Women's Lobby to be part of this discussion on the equality model, because we believe that is the best model, the most efficient one to combat sexual exploitation, sexual trafficking and prostitution. We admire Sweden for having put this model into place and also inspiring other countries which have also been present and showed an important way forward. The EWL represents 2,000 women's organizations throughout Europe, and we also coordinate the so-called Brussels Call, which has existed since 2012, and it unites more than 200 civil society organizations, partly present here, who also include survivor-led organizations and who all fight for the equality model. Okay. Thank you. So it is important to underline that there is a direct link between prostitution and human trafficking, and this cannot be repeated enough, because trafficking for sexual exploitation would not exist without the demand for prostituted women. Studies show very clearly that where prostitution is legalized, there are larger international human trafficking inflows. So the more visible and normalized the sex trade gets, the more opportunities there are for pimps and traffickers to expand their so-called business. And we think this is totally unacceptable in today's society. Besides, it's being confirmed through the latest update published by the European Commission in December that trafficking for sexual exploitation purpose is still the main type of trafficking in the EU, representing 51% of all trafficking cases. Also, the main victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation are women, and 87% of persons trafficked for this purpose are women and girls. It recognizes also that among the high-risk sectors for sexual exploitation, as in previous years, we can find prostitution, escort agencies and services, as well as the pornography industry. It's interesting to notice also that in countries that have the opposite views to the equality models, they are the ones that rank on top positions per the number of female victims of trafficking. So if we take this list, Romania is on top of it, also the Netherlands, Germany, and Austria. So at the EU level, we do welcome several good measures suggested by the European Commission's new proposal for an update of the anti-trafficking directive. To list those, first, forced marriage and illegal adoption explicitly were added as forms of exploitation that the member states should criminalize in all circumstances. Then there are mandatory sanctions for companies held accountable for trafficking crimes. Also, it's a step forward that the mandatory criminalization of the knowing use of a service, so-called service, provided by a victim of trafficking has been decided to be introduced because only 8 member states criminalized the knowing use of exploited acts related to all forms of exploitation so far. Fourth, there is also a call for EU-wide annual data collection on trafficking in human beings to be published by Eurostat. And fifth, improved criminal law response to the online challenges is very, very timely. At the same time, we regret that the criminalization is only on the knowing use of a so-called service provided by a victim of trafficking. And hereby, I would like to repeat what other colleagues have said about this. We strongly believe that this knowing provision hinders the prosecution of perpetrators that can easily escape justice by claiming ignorance. And we should follow the path of Cyprus, as we have heard, which is the only member state so far that criminalizes the use of exploited acts in relation to sexual exploitation without this knowledge requirement. The Commission has recognized in the past that prostitution markets are connected to trafficking. However, this directive review is not brave enough to tackle the situation, in our view. On the contrary, the draft proposal considers that the purchase of sexual acts is beyond trafficking and hence the scope of the directive. The problem is that the Commission is not enforcing its mandate to act against all forms of sexual exploitation in women, which is recognized as a Eurocrime in the treaties, precisely linked to the crime of trafficking by doing this. However, we strongly encourage EU decision makers to use all the opportunities in place, and by this I'd like to come to another proposed directive on combating violence against women and domestic violence to tackle the issue of prostitution, and we would like to encourage them to introduce the equality model through this proposed legislation as well. The two co-rapporteurs in the European Parliament have done a really good job to ensure that the EP draft report covers all forms of sexual exploitation at the moment, including the sexual exploitation for the prostitution of others and the purchase of sexual services acts. We therefore encourage members of the European Parliament, all members, to vote in favor of these provisions in the upcoming initiative report on prostitution, which is the third instrument, and to resist all attempts of minimizing the inherent violence in prostitution, especially by using a work narrative. And finally, I would like to share with you some resources that we produced on this topic, and I would like to especially invite you to visit the website of the Brussels School to explore the campaign of the equality model launched by our Swedish member as well. You can see the link here. And also, I would like to share with you our latest publication on this, which is also available there, and which contains up-to-date information also on the acceptance of the equality model in our societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rika. That was very interesting. Now we turn to Ms. Dmitrieva. And you have a long experience as a women's rights advocate, and you are also a supporter of the equality model. Why has it been important for you, and how has the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine affected the situation regarding violence against women and sexual exploitation in Ukraine? And what is needed on a national and international level to stop further exploitation? Maria, please.
Okay, thank you. And with your permission, I will be standing. It's much easier to gesticulate this way. So, the question you asked me pretty much can be turned into several doctoral theses, but we don't have that much time, and I will try to be concise. And I will start with thanking Sweden, Swedish government, and the organizers of this conference of putting it together. And I hope next time we will meet in New York, where UN Women will put forward an initiative to introduce the abolitionist model as a new human rights standard. The second thing I want to say is to thank the brave women and men of Ukraine who are standing right now on the front lines and defending not only the existence of the Ukrainian people, but also the values we all hold dear, the human rights, human dignity, and peace for all. For me, personally, the dawn of equality model shined in 2004 when I met one of the women who were founding mothers of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, Janice Raymond. And she explained to me that legalization, as a young feminist, I believe the legalization is the way to go, that it will protect the women. But she explained to me this is not how it works. And ever since, I have been a very staunch and loud proponent of the equality model. And since 2016, the organization that I work with, Democracy Development Center, which, despite the name, is actually a women's rights organization. I know it's a generic name, but we have to work with what we've got, right? And so since 2016, when there was an attempt to legalize prostitution in Ukraine, we became very vocal about this issue. For the context, in Ukraine, prostitution has been decriminalized in 2006. Since then, it has been an administrative offense fined in the amount of $2. But it has been used by pimps and by police. Sometimes, we know police can be corrupt. Sometimes, okay? So they have been using this charge to keep young women and women who are not so young anymore in prostitution, in drug trade, by blackmailing them. And the first thing that we wanted to accomplish was to remove this article from the Criminal Code of Ukraine. We so far have been unsuccessful. As to the numbers, before the war began in 2014, the only organizations that kept any kind of track of how many women are in prostitution in Ukraine were HIV servicing organizations. And their data said that there were about 60,000 women in Ukraine for the population of 42 million. So this number is significantly higher than we saw in European countries. And this number doesn't include younger persons, adolescents who are younger than 18, and it doesn't include those who engage in prostitution from time to time, in addition to their main income, and who do this who don't acknowledge that they're in prostitution, pretty much. The term that they use for these women is very telling: women of commercial sex. And they have been concentrating mostly on harm reduction, which we know doesn't work the way that is intended. Since the war began, the number rose to estimate 100,000. Again, not including all those on the fridges. And right now, nobody has the data. And we work with one sex workers organization in Ukraine. There are two officially registered sex workers organizations in Ukraine. One is demanding legalization of prostitution. The other one is demanding the Nordic model. So, sex workers demanding the Nordic model is one of our major achievements. So, we are cooperating with them. We are sending packages to the most vulnerable women who are falling through the cracks by every other program and support that provides humanitarian support in Ukraine. And they say that they are destitute. Their situation has gone significantly worse, and they cannot have access to any services at all. So, when we are talking about the situation of women in prostitution in Ukraine, I would say that it is pretty dire, but nobody has the data to confirm it. So, I also wanted to give you a little bit of a context of what was going on in Ukraine, because it was said a lot yesterday, including by our Vice Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic Integration, Oksana Stefanishina, what is going on in Ukraine. But as a women's rights activist working on the ground, I think I can give you a little better understanding of what is going on. And for the record, if you have any additional questions for me, if you have any additional questions about what is going on with Ukrainian women's organizations or in women in general, I am absolutely happy to answer all your questions after the panel. And I will give you my email, and if you have some specific requests I cannot complete right now, I either will answer your email later, or I will put you in touch with the person in Ukraine who does have the information that you may require. I will talk a little bit about what women's organizations are doing and women in general are doing, and then I will offer 4 suggestions that I have for our esteemed audience and for the European Union and for the UN, for that matter. So, for the context, as I said, we have, before the invasion, we had around 42 million. Of these 42 million, about from 5 to 8 million are right now outside of the country, mostly in global north. We also, most of them are women and children. We also have about 2 million Ukrainian citizens who have been forcibly deported to Russia, and at least 15,000 confirmed cases of Ukrainian children being taken to Russia to be forcibly adopted, with all their personal data changed, including name, date of birth, place of birth, and surname, which makes it impossible to track their whereabouts. And we expect that a lot of those who were taken to Russia and who are now trying to return to Ukraine may be subject to trafficking, both in Russia and its neighboring countries. We saw the horrific numbers yesterday about the growing surge of demand for Ukrainian refugees on porn resources, on resources that advertise prostitution. This demand is not going to dissipate by itself. It's going to translate into actual people being abducted or used or forced into these areas. So we also have about 8 to 10 million displaced internally in the country. So that makes it half of the Ukrainian population being displaced to this or that degree, which makes them vulnerable, torn away from their communities, from their families, from their support networks, from jobs, from 1/3 to 1/2 of our economy has been incapacitated by direct hits by the Russian army, and where they occupied the territories, they pretty much pillaged everything down to toilet bowls. I don't know where they're taking them, because like 60% of their population doesn't have running water in their houses, and they don't know anywhere to plug those toilet bowls in, but they did take them anyway. So we also, about 1/3 of the population of Ukraine is now unemployed, right? Another issue we are facing right now is the mine contamination of the lands, which makes it difficult, if not impossible, to till the land and to grow crops. It puts at risk not only the Ukrainian population, but the population of those countries in Africa and Asia who are dependent on Ukraine for their food supplies. And we know that with the climate change and food shortages, these people will be at a risk of climate migration, and they will be also in this growing group of vulnerable people who can be subjected to trafficking and other forms of exploitation. Another form, like we were talking yesterday, not me, others were talking, right? About pornography and prostitution, and surrogacy is another issue that has been on the rise in Europe. We know from Ukrainian women in Europe that they are targeted specifically as Ukrainian citizens of a female persuasion to go into egg donation and surrogacy programs. Because our legislation, unfortunately, is extremely lax, and Ukraine has been for a long time a place where racist people who cannot go to India to get their babies there would come and get their European presenting, quote, babies. And well, one thing we don't have is gender self-ID for now, fortunately, but I really hope you will deal with it before we ascend to European Union, and we don't have to fight that as well. And what Ukrainian, so there is a lot more to talk about the challenges that we are facing, but let's move on to better things to discuss. Ukrainian women. Ukrainian women have been a blessing to Ukraine, because without us, Ukraine would have stopped existing. Ukrainian women have been a significant part of a war effort. Ukrainian women have been a significant part of volunteer effort. Ukrainian women organizations, since the beginning of the invasion, on top of their regular workload, took on humanitarian assistance to displaced people, even if they are displaced themselves. And also, I have to praise, to put due where it is, our government and our parliament did support finally and ratify the Istanbul Convention, which is a huge step for us, finally. And our parliament is now considering the legislation that would legalize civil partnerships for gays and lesbians, which would be a significant step forward in protection of their rights.
Maria, sorry, I have to...
proposals, and I'm done?
Yeah, proposals.
Okay, good. Again, if you have questions, I will be happy to answer them. My proposals. When Ukraine assents to the EU, it's not only us who has to be worthy of this, it's the EU that has to be worthy of us. And we need you to place emphasis on demand and criminalize demand for prostitution, for pornography, and for surrogacy. Second point, we need to expand the definition of conflict-related sexual violence to include not only forced prostitution, but prostitution in general, because women on occupied territories, not only in Ukraine, but any other country facing armed conflict or disaster, these women are in an extremely vulnerable position. They need this support. Third point, I know that there are no NATO people here, but NATO has two policies specifically that I know of that address the issue. The zero policy towards sexual exploitation and zero policy towards conflict-related sexual violence. And if you look at the Women, Peace, Security Agenda, CEDAW, and these two NATO policies, when they overlap, in the center you will get this addressing the demand. Last point, when you develop in your countries the women, peace, security and action plans, you have to include prostitution and trafficking in them as well, and you have to include migrant women, not only from Ukraine, but other countries with conflict as well, so that they participate in determining priorities and determining the actions to respond to these priorities. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you. And I'm so sorry that I had to cut you short because it was very interesting, and we can continue to speak about these issues during the lunch and even after the conference. And for our last panelist here, the European Commission presented their proposal for a revised directive on trafficking in human beings in December last year, as we have heard. And it is now up to the European Parliament and the Council to agree on a final directive based on that proposal. And the committee dealing with this directive in the European Parliament is the Committee on Civil Liberties, or the LIBE Committee. And the chair, Juan Fernando López Aguilar, he has made a video contribution to us, but unfortunately we do not have time to play it now, but I hope that we can put it on the conference website so that we can make sure that everyone can see the message from Mr. López Aguilar. And I will instead turn to Malin Björk, member of the European Parliament and the Committee on the Civil Liberties, and I will give you 7 minutes to elaborate on these issues and the equality model and how it plays into all of this. So please, Malin.
Thank you very much. I know that Juan Fernando López Aguilar, he would have wanted to be here as well. He's the chair of our committee, and he is also very supportive of the work on trafficking and also working with a very strong gender equality perspective. So that's just for you to know. And I must say that in 1999, when the Swedish law was passed, I was not yet having a political mandate in the European Parliament or elsewhere. I was part of the women's movement, and I was so happy about what was then called the Swedish law. And it's no longer, and having worked now at EU level and in international context for quite some time, it's no longer like the Swedish model and the Swedish law. It is really the equality model. Because I've been here now, been listening, and there's France, there is Ireland, there is Northern Ireland, there is Norway. And we're getting to be a bunch of countries that do the equality model slightly different, and some countries better than Sweden. So we have to look there, and we have to look at the exit programs and the things, and to improve. But it is very clear that I had, I would say, the best schooling. I was among feminists, and I got all the strength and the knowledge that is needed to carry forward and to be in this capacity and in a political mandate. And I work on issues in the European Parliament that has to do with women's rights, SRHR, sexual and reproductive health and rights, right to abortion care, young people's right to sexuality education, etc., and also on LGBTI rights. So for me, the equality model is also connected to all that piece of work. The work for gender equality and for equality. And today I will be working in the upcoming year on the proposal for a new directive, or revised directive on trafficking that has been addressed several times here. I will be the rapporteur, as it's called in EU language. It means that you are the responsible negotiator or chief negotiator. We are putting it to our negotiating team, and the other political forces in the European Parliament would have their negotiating teams. And I think it's an extremely important moment, and it's a priority for, I know, the chair of our committee, but also for myself, to make this happen. It's not that, political life continues after a legislature, but if you want to get something done, I think we have this window of opportunity of this year. So we will work very hard on this piece of legislation. And for me, the equality model, it impacts all parts. Most of you that it's only a limited revision of the directive on the national referral mechanism, on the legal persons, on the sanctions that was mentioned here, confiscation, online aspects, and addressing the demand. But for me, it impacts all of them. But I will not be able to go deeper onto in which ways. I will actually focus on the more overarching way I think it influences our work and should influence it in the European Parliament. And many of it has been mentioned here, because when you're the last speaker in a panel, you can just say, as Jonas and as Åsa and as Lydia and etc. But it is actually about changing norms. And that is about prevention, of course. No demand, no buyers, no need for trafficking victims. So it is about demand reduction or even elimination. And it's also then to tell, I live between Belgium and Sweden, and I can tell my teenage boy that, it's illegal to buy consent. You cannot do that. You speak about consent, and then somebody says, well, if you pay, it's okay, then it's consent. So I said, no, it doesn't work like that. You cannot buy consent, and it's illegal in France and in Sweden and in Norway. I don't know why it's not like that in Belgium, but what we, the model we are working against is the one is the Swedish and French that's surrounding him and all these other boys. And it was mentioned here about the educational programs, Lydia. You said, well, it has to be said. It has to be said. If you respect women and girls, you don't buy consent, you don't buy them. So for me, the equality model is about that, being able to say that to a whole, in society, and to educate boys and men and women and girls, to give them a very, very strong message also, as you asked for, Lydia. So that's one part of the picture. And it also means that, you name who is the perpetrator and who is being exploited. That's part of a feminist perspective on this, and it's part of the equality model for me. Then the second part of this, and it was part of the panel, the first panel this morning, which is extremely important when we will come down to this, working on this piece of legislation. It is the law enforcement perspective. And I was very happy to hear from all the experts and prosecutors and lawyers and Eurojust and Europol, actors that actually try to make these laws work in practice. So that is the other perspective, of course. So we in the European Parliament has to look very carefully what has worked and what has not worked. And for me, it is very clear that there is very strong evidence that shows that the equality model is what is working for law enforcement. And then the third part that I will be working on together with the colleagues in my committee is, of course, the support and protection to victims. Because the equality model was all about that also. We can say that we're not perfectly there, that we need to improve things, but it is central to the equality model. So it has to be about decriminalizing women and girls and people being bought in prostitution, and to provide exit programs. That there is alternatives. You spoke about income support and other types of supports for victims in the sex market. And there has to be also then the support has to be, we have to look at if it is that so and so many percentages are migrant women, then we have to make sure that the support is tailored for that situation. And I don't think we're there at all. It also means that victims should have access to justice and reparation. And that is not the case either yet. But I think the equality models puts all those demands on us as politicians to make that difference. We cannot fail when it comes to changing norms and scale up prevention. We cannot fail when it comes to improve law enforcement. And we cannot fail when it comes to protect and support the victims. And it's the equality model that puts that bar high. So I thank everyone that has been here and contributed, and for the commitment by the Swedish government, of course, and for having during your presidency, and then we will have the Spanish presidency. It will be extremely important to put the bar very high, because this is maybe the end message here. We have the opportunity now to make a difference in this directive. And the EU sometimes makes law that become not so useful, or maybe irrelevant sometimes. We can have that as, that is a possible outcome. But I will not work, and my colleagues in the committee, we will work for an outcome that puts the bar very high, because this is our chance to make a difference for women and girls, and for a society that is based on gender equality, and where you do not, use and abuse people in prostitution and in trafficking. So, this is our opportunity to make the EU very relevant, or not so relevant. And I know what I choose in that, and I hope I have very many of you to be able to work together towards that objective. I have heard that today and yesterday during the days, and I look very much forward to working with all of you, the survivor-led organizations, with all your policy experience, expertise, but also law enforcement actors, NGOs, and of course also with the Swedish presidency and the council. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Malin. Thank you. And a great thank you to all of our panel and everyone who have contributed to the important discussions throughout this whole conference. We've heard experiences from policymakers, civil society, law enforcement, and survivors. We've heard about the situation in the world and the impact of armed conflict and inequality. We've heard how the work against the demand that fosters trafficking for sexual purposes can be conducted, and how legislative models can be an important part of this. And we've heard how the equality model is used to target the demand for sexual services, and how it is an important tool to combat trafficking in human beings for sexual purposes. I firmly believe that we all leave this conference a little bit wiser and prepared to take on the task to step up the work against trafficking in human beings for sexual purposes. I will now hand over the floor to the Swedish Minister for Gender Equality and Working Life, Paulina Brandberg, for closing remarks. Thank you so much. We can go down now, yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My colleague Gunnar Strömmer, the Minister of Justice, said in the beginning of this conference that he hoped that these 24 hours would have an impact on the future of tackling trafficking in human beings for sexual purposes. We do have a very serious situation in the world, and I am humble about the challenges we are facing when it comes to combating trafficking for sexual purposes. Armed conflict, refugee crises, inequality. It all plays into the hands of the traffickers. And there is an enormous profit to be made for those in the business of exploiting the most vulnerable groups in society. We need to take the experiences from those in the front lines of working against trafficking and the persons sharing experiences of exploitation. We have heard about the critical situation that is on the rise due to the Russian aggression against Ukraine. The women and children that have fled are now at risk of being exploited. And the situation in Ukraine is far from the only one putting women and children at risk. We have heard about several examples of people from other countries being trafficked in Europe, trafficked to Europe in order to be exploited in prostitution. I am humble about the challenges that we face, but I am also hopeful. We have listened to so many voices of change throughout this conference. Voices that tell us that there are things to be done, things that work. It is clear that trafficking in human beings cannot be conquered by just one measure. There is no quick fix. But the work against the demand that fosters trafficking for sexual purposes plays a central role here. Because as long as there are people willing to pay for the bodies of women and girls and boys and LGBTIQ persons, the trafficking will go on. It is absolutely crucial to never lose sight of the gender perspective and how it impacts trafficking for sexual purposes. Prostitution is a form of gender-based violence, and it can never be accepted in an equal society. We have talked about how Sweden was the first country in the world to adopt a legislation that criminalizes the purchase, but not the sale, of sexual services. This was back in 1999, and it was a controversial law. But Sweden is now no longer alone in this approach. Several countries have followed, and more are hopefully to come. For example, we have heard about the French experiences. We have a lot to learn from the work being done there when it comes to, for example, offering support for those wanting to leave prostitution. Another thing that is crystal clear is the need for cooperation. Cooperation between different agencies and authorities, with civil society and on an international level. Trafficking in human beings knows no borders, and it is a responsibility for the world as a community to make sure that it is being conquered. Cooperation also helps the exchange of best practices. As we have learned throughout this conference, the work against trafficking for sexual purposes is constantly evolving. We have to stay on top and continue to advance our efforts, as the traffickers will continue to find new ways to advance their operations. I do believe that these 24 hours will have an impact on the future of tackling trafficking in human beings for sexual purposes. It is now up to all of us to strengthen and develop this important work. I am very grateful for all the new insights I have received during this conference. I hope you feel the same. Thank you all very much.